Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Elijah Harmon, and I am 32 years old. This happened in October 2023. I've always considered myself a rational man, someone who believes in what he can see, touch, and understand. That's how I was raised. My father was a physics professor at Kansas State, and I followed in his scientific footsteps, becoming a chemical engineer. I tell you this so you understand that what I'm about to share isn't the ramblings of someone prone to flights of fancy or someone easily spooked by shadows in the dark. My best friend since college, Nathan Wells, and I had planned this camping trip to Tuttle Creek State Park for months. We both needed to escape the suffocating pressure of our corporate jobs in Kansas City. Nathan worked in finance and was struggling with a recent divorce, while I was dealing with burnout after a failed product launch. Both of us just wanted to disconnect from our digital lives and reconnect with nature, and with each other. Our friendship had suffered from neglect over the past few years as we'd focused on our careers and relationships. We chose Tuttle Creek because it was remote enough to feel like a true escape, yet still reasonably accessible from the city. Located just north of Manhattan, Kansas, the park boasts nearly 13,000 acres of rugged land surrounding the second-largest reservoir in the state. It's known for its dense forests, rocky outcroppings, and miles of hiking trails that cut through the Flint Hills region. We arrived at the park on a Friday afternoon in late October. The campground was nearly empty. Most people consider the Kansas camping season over by then, but we appreciated the solitude. The autumn colors were in full display. Rich golds, deep reds, and burnt oranges painted the landscape. The crisp air carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and distant wood smoke. "Man, we should have been doing this every year," Nathan said as we unloaded our gear from his Jeep Cherokee. He looked better already. I'd been worried about him since the divorce. 6 months ago, when his wife left him for her personal trainer, Nathan had become a shell of himself. He'd lost weight, rarely shaved, and the dark circles under his eyes had become a permanent feature. But out here, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees, I could see glimmers of the old Nathan returning. "Better late than never," I replied, hauling our cooler to the fire ring. "This trip is long overdue." We set up camp efficiently. We'd done this countless times in college, and soon had our tent pitched, firewood collected, and dinner preparations underway. As the sun began to set, we sat by the fire, drinking beers and catching up on each other's lives beyond the superficial updates we'd shared over occasional texts. "I don't know, Eli," Nathan sighed, staring into the flames. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions. Wake up, work, come home to an empty house, repeat. What's the point?" I didn't have an easy answer for him. My own life wasn't exactly fulfilling, despite my outward success. "Maybe that's why we're here," I offered, "to remember there's more to life than just the daily grind." As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped rapidly. Our campsite was positioned at the edge of a clearing, with dense forest at our backs and a view of the lake through the trees in front of us. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky, which was brilliantly clear and crowded with stars. That's when we heard it. The first strange sound of the trip. A long, mournful wail that seemed to float across the lake. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't any animal I recognized either. "What the hell was that?" Nathan asked, his body tensing. "Probably just a coyote," I said, though I wasn't convinced. It had sounded different, higher pitched and more sustained than a coyote's howl. "Didn't sound like any coyote I've ever heard," Nathan muttered. We listened intently for several minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, the tension eased and we resumed our conversation, though I noticed we both spoke more quietly now, as if afraid to attract attention from whatever had made that noise. As we prepared for bed, I noticed Nathan checking his phone repeatedly. "No signal, huh?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not a bar, and my battery's draining like crazy too. It was at 80% when we got here, now it's down to 15%. I checked my own phone and found the same issue. No signal and rapidly depleting battery despite being in airplane mode. Weird. Must be something about this location. Let's just turn them off and save what's left in case of emergency. We climbed into the tent and settled into our sleeping bags. Despite the physical exhaustion from setting up camp and the pleasant buzz from the beers, sleep didn't come easily. That strange cry kept echoing in my mind, and the forest around us seemed alive with small sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and occasionally something that sounded like footsteps circling our campsite. "You hear that?" Nathan whispered around midnight. "Yeah," I admitted. "Probably just deer." Neither of us mentioned that deer don't typically approach active campsites, especially ones that still smelled of food and fire. We both eventually drifted into uneasy sleep. I awoke suddenly, heart pounding, though I wasn't sure why. The inside of the tent was pitch black, and the air had grown significantly colder. My watch showed 3:17 a.m., the notorious witching hour. I had to smile at myself for even thinking that, my scientific mind rebelling against such superstition. Then I realized what had woken me. Complete silence. The forest that had been alive with sound earlier was now utterly still. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, no night birds calling. Nothing. The silence felt thick, oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, and Nathan was gone. His sleeping bag was empty beside me, the nylon material still warm from his body heat. He must have just gotten up, probably to relieve himself. I called his name softly, not wanting to disturb the unnatural quiet, but received no answer. Reluctantly, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to make out the clearing. Our camping chairs were still positioned by the fire, our coolers secure on the picnic table. Everything looked normal, except there was no sign of Nathan. "Nathan!" I called again, louder this time. My voice sounded flat in the dead air, not caring as it should have. I grabbed my headlamp and slipped on my boots, stepping out of the tent. The cold hit me immediately. It had to be near freezing now, much colder than forecast. My breath formed dense clouds in front of my face as I swept the beam of light around our campsite. That's when I noticed the tracks. Leading from our tent toward the densest part of the forest were footprints. Human footprints, but something was wrong with them. They started as normal shoe prints that matched Nathan's hiking boots, but as they progressed toward the tree line, they began to change. The last few visible prints before disappearing into the darkness of the woods looked elongated, with what appeared to be claw marks at the ends of the toes. I told myself it was a trick of the soil, or my imagination, or the poor lighting from my headlamp, but a deep, primal part of me knew better. "Nathan!" I shouted, no longer concerned about the silence. My voice echoed briefly and then seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. I hesitated at the edge of the woods, my light playing over the twisted trunks of oak and hickory trees. Every instinct told me not to follow those tracks, but Nathan was my friend. I couldn't just stand there while he might be in trouble. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the forest. Immediately, the air felt different, heavier, damper, and somehow older, as if I'd stepped through a portal into a more primeval version of the woods. The smell changed, too, from the pleasant earthiness of autumn to something fetid and rotting. I followed the tracks as best I could, though they became harder to discern on the carpet of fallen leaves. The trees grew increasingly dense, and several times I had to squeeze between trunks that seemed to be growing abnormally close together. My sense of direction began to fail me. I knew I should be heading directly away from the campsite, but the path seemed to wind and double back on itself. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes according to my watch, I emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an enormous dead oak tree. its bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. And tied to the trunk, slumped but apparently conscious, was Nathan. Nathan! I rushed forward, then stopped abruptly as the smell hit me. A powerful, musky odor like wet fur and decay. Nathan raised his head weakly. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Eli," he croaked, "run! Please run!" "I'm not leaving you," I said, approaching more cautiously now, scanning the clearing for whatever had brought him here. "It's a Wendigo," he whispered. "It made me walk here. It was in my head, Eli. It's still here." I began working at the crude bindings holding him to the tree, strips of what looked like raw hide, though they felt strangely warm to the touch, almost as if they were still living tissue. "What are you talking about? Who did this to you?" I demanded, my fingers struggling with the tight knots. "Not? Who? What?" Nathan's eyes suddenly widened, looking at something over my shoulder. "It's here." I turned slowly, my headlamp illuminating the edge of the clearing. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, detaching itself from the darkness between two trees. It stepped forward into the dim circle of my light, and I felt my sanity begin to fray at the edges. The creature was tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin, like a person who had been stretched on a rack. Its skin was a sickly grayish-white, pulled tight over a skeletal frame, and covered in patches with coarse, dark hair. The head was the worst part, vaguely deer-like but wrong, with 2 long jaws filled with needle-sharp teeth and eyes that reflected my light like a predator's, glowing an unnatural amber red. "Jesus Christ," I breathed, my hands frozen on Nathan's bindings. "That name has no power here," the creature said, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Its mouth didn't move when it spoke. Instead, I heard the words directly in my mind. I fumbled for the hunting knife I'd brought along, a 6-inch blade that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. The Wendigo, if that's truly what it was, cocked its head at my movement, studying me with those terrible eyes. "I haven't feasted on human flesh in decades," it said, taking another step forward. "The park rangers keep your kind away from my territory, but you two, you walked right in. A gift." "Stay back," I warned, brandishing the knife, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound authoritative. The creature made a sound that might have been laughter, a dry, rattling noise like wind through dead leaves. "Your friend's mind was easy to enter, full of despair and emptiness. Yours will be more challenging, but hunger sharpens my power." I felt something then, a cold pressure against my consciousness, like icy fingers probing at the edges of my mind. A wave of despair washed over me, and with it came thoughts that didn't feel like my own. Images of walking calmly into the creature's embrace, of laying down my knife, of offering myself as willingly as a sacrificial lamb. "No!" I shouted, the sound of my own voice breaking the mental intrusion. I slashed wildly with the knife as the Wendigo lunged forward with inhuman speed. The blade connected, drawing a line across its emaciated chest. The creature howled, that same eerie cry we'd heard across the lake earlier, and black ichor oozed from the wound. The smell was overpowering, like rancid meat and sulfur. The Wendigo stumbled back, more surprised than injured. "You resist," it hissed. "Interesting. Your friend had no such strength." I used the moment to cut through the final binding holding Nathan to the tree. He slumped forward into my arms, barely conscious. "Can you walk?" I asked urgently. "I think so," he mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "But Eli, it's still in my head. I can feel it." The Wendigo circled us slowly, keeping just outside the range of my knife. I could feel its hunger as a tangible force, pressing against my consciousness like a physical weight. "The Pawnee knew of me," the creature said conversationally, as if we were having a pleasant chat rather than a life-or-death confrontation. "They left offerings at the edge of the forest to keep me appeased. But then your people came, with their dams and their parks. cutting me off from my hunting grounds. I began slowly backing away, supporting Nathan with one arm while keeping the knife extended with the other. The Wendigo matched our retreat step for step. "The hunger never leaves," it continued. "I've eaten deer, coyotes, the occasional lost hiker, but it's never enough. Human fear, human despair, that's what truly nourishes me." We reached the edge of the clearing. If I could just get Nathan back to the campsite, maybe we could make it to the jeep. But as I turned to find the path we'd come from, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember which way we'd come. Every direction looked identical, dark trees closing in on all sides. "You won't find your way back without me allowing it," the Wendigo said, seeming to read my thoughts. "This is my domain. The paths obey my will." I felt Nathan stiffen beside me. "Eli," he whispered, his voice suddenly different, harder, colder. "Just leave me. Save yourself. I'm already gone." I looked at my friend and saw his eyes had changed. The warm brown replaced by that same amber-red glow I'd seen in the Wendigo's eyes. A slow, unnatural smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that seemed suddenly too sharp. "Nathan, fight it!" I shouted, shaking him. "It's in your head. Don't listen." The Wendigo laughed again, that terrible dry rustling. "He can't hear you anymore. His mind was broken before you even came here. So full of grief and self-loathing, the perfect vessel." Nathan lunged at me suddenly, hands clawing for my throat. I stumbled backward, unwilling to use the knife on my friend. His strength was unnatural. His fingers dug into my neck with crushing force as we fell together to the forest floor. "Nathan!" I gasped, struggling to break his grip. "This isn't you!" For just a moment, I saw recognition flicker in his eyes, a brief return of the real Nathan, before the possession reasserted itself. But that moment was enough. His grip loosened slightly, allowing me to bring my knee up hard into his stomach. As he doubled over, I scrambled away, putting distance between us. The Wendigo watched our struggle with obvious amusement. "Even if you kill this vessel, I'll still have you," it said. "One way or another, you'll nourish me tonight." I looked from the monster to my possessed friend, who was slowly getting to his feet, that unnatural grin still fixed on his face. I needed a plan, and I needed it now. Fire! The legend said Wendigos feared fire. I still had my lighter in my pocket. I'd used it to start our campfire earlier, but how could I create a substantial enough blaze to drive the creature back? Nathan stalked toward me again, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Behind him, the Wendigo seemed content to watch, savoring our fear like an aperitif before the main course. I backed up against the massive dead oak that Nathan had been tied to. My fingers touched something on the bark, a sticky residue that smelled strongly of pine sap. The tree was dead, but it must have been oozing resin before it died. Resin was flammable. With Nathan closing in, I made a desperate gamble. I pulled out my lighter, flicked it to life, and touched the flame to the bark where the resin was thickest. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a whoosh, the dried wood and resin caught fire, flames racing up the ancient trunk with supernatural speed. The clearing was suddenly bathed in flickering orange light. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound so piercing and inhuman that I had to cover my ears. Nathan stopped his advance, his body convulsing as the creature's control wavered. "Nathan!" I shouted over the roar of the rapidly spreading fire. "Come back to me!" His eyes flickered, red to brown, as he fought for control of his own mind. The Wendigo howled again, backing away from the growing inferno. The dead oak was now completely engulfed, a towering pillar of flame that illuminated the entire clearing. With the Wendigo's attention divided between the fire and maintaining its hold on Nathan, I saw my chance. I rushed forward, tackling my friend to the ground, away from the burning tree. As we hit the earth, Nathan's body went rigid, then limp. His eyes rolled back in his head, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was dead. Then he gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. His eyes, when they focused again, were his own. "Eli?" he croaked. "I'm here. Can you move? We need to go. Now." The Wendigo was retreating to the edge of the clearing, its form seeming to waver and distort in the firelight. But I knew its withdrawal was temporary. The flames would only hold it at bay for so long. With strength born of desperation, I hauled Nathan to his feet. The fire had created a strange phenomenon. The clearing was now clearly lit, and I could see a path leading away from it that I was certain hadn't been visible before. Whether it was the right path back to our campsite, I couldn't be sure, but it was our only option. Supporting Nathan, who was still weak and disoriented, I hurried down the path. Behind us, the Wendigo's frustrated howls echoed through the forest, along with the increasingly loud crackling of the burning tree. I realized with horror that I might have started a forest fire, but right then, survival took precedence over environmental concerns. The path twisted and turned, but unlike before, it seemed to be leading us consistently in one direction. After about 10 minutes of stumbling through the woods, I began to recognize landmarks. A distinctive lightning-struck tree, a peculiar rock formation that told me we were indeed heading back toward our campsite. Nathan grew stronger with each step away from the Wendigo's influence. By the time our tent came into view, he was walking under his own power, though he remained unnaturally quiet. "We need to get out of here," I said, already starting to break down the tent. Nathan nodded, his eyes haunted. "It's still out there. I can feel it, Eli, at the edges of my mind." We packed with frantic efficiency, tossing gear haphazardly into the Jeep. As I was securing the cooler, I noticed a park ranger's truck pulling into the campsite area, probably investigating the fire that was now visible as an orange glow through the trees. The ranger, his name tag read J. Martinez, approached us with a flashlight in hand. "Everything okay here, folks? We've got reports of smoke from this area." I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. Would he believe the truth? "We're just packing up," I said finally. "Decided to cut our trip short." Ranger Martinez narrowed his eyes, taking in our disheveled appearance and the haphazard way we'd packed. "That fire in the woods, you know anything about that?" Before I could fabricate an explanation, Nathan spoke up, his voice stronger than I expected. "There's something out there, Ranger. Something not natural. It took me. It was in my head." The Ranger's expression changed subtly, not to the skepticism I expected, but to something like grim recognition. "Where exactly did you encounter it?" he asked quietly. Surprised by his response, I described the clearing with the dead oak. "About 20 minutes that way," I added, pointing. Ranger Martinez nodded slowly. "That area's been off limits for years. Signs must have been removed again. 3rd time this month." He sighed heavily. "You boys are lucky. Not everyone who encounters the Tuttle Creek Wendigo lives to tell about it." My blood ran cold. "You know about it. Why isn't this place shut down?" "The Park Service doesn't officially acknowledge it," he said, "but those of us who work here know. The indigenous people knew too. This was Pawnee land once, and they had rituals to keep it contained. We do what we can, patrol the danger zones, keep campers away from its territory." He glanced at Nathan. "How are you feeling, son?" "Like my head's been split open," Nathan admitted, "and I keep hearing whispers." The ranger reached into his truck and retrieved what looked like a small leather pouch. "Here, traditional medicine. Sage, sweetgrass, cedar, tobacco. Keep it with you for the next few days. It might help clear your mind." Nathan accepted the pouch wordlessly, clutching it like a lifeline. "You should go now," Ranger Martinez said. "I'll deal with the fire and file the report. Just an escaped campfire officially." He hesitated, then added, "I wouldn't come back here if I were you, and I'd keep quiet about what you saw. Most people won't believe you, and those who might, well, they might come looking for it. That never ends well." We finished loading the Jeep in silence. As we drove away, I caught a last glimpse of the ranger in the rearview mirror, standing still, watching us leave, the orange glow of the distant fire illuminating his solemn face. The drive back to Kansas City was tense and quiet. Nathan clutched the medicine pouch to his chest the entire way, occasionally murmuring words I couldn't make out. I didn't press him. We were both processing what had happened in our own ways. It's been a year since that night at Tuttle Creek. Nathan moved to Colorado shortly after our trip, saying he needed mountains and sunshine and as much distance from Kansas as he could get. We still talk occasionally, but there's a barrier between us now. The shared experience of something neither of us can fully comprehend or explain has paradoxically driven us apart rather than brought us closer. As for me, I've thrown myself back into my work, finding comfort in the clean logic of chemical equations and manufacturing processes. But I've changed, too. I no longer dismiss the stories my grandmother used to tell about the old world, the world beyond the veil of what we consider reality. I no longer scoff at legends or folklore. And I never, ever camp anymore, not even in my backyard. Sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the wind howls outside my apartment window, I swear I can hear that same eerie cry we first heard across Tuttle Creek Lake. And in my dreams, I still see those glowing amber-red eyes watching me from the darkness between the trees. Ranger Martinez was right about one thing. People don't believe us. I've told this story exactly once to a therapist who gently suggested I was suffering from shared delusion brought on by isolation and stress. That's why I'm writing it down now, anonymously. Not to convince anyone, but simply to get it out of my system. Because the worst part isn't the memory of that night. It's the feeling I've had ever since. The unshakable certainty that something followed us back from those woods. Something patient and ancient that can wait years, decades, even centuries for its meal. Something that whispers to me in my darkest moments that it's still hungry, and that it remembers my name. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in June 2024. The Kansas wind has a voice. I never believed that until I heard it whispering my name through the tall prairie grass of the Flint Hills. It doesn't just howl or moan like they say in stories. It speaks. And what it told me that night at Z-Bar Ranch changed everything I thought I knew about reality. My decision to go off-grid wasn't impulsive. After 12 years in a Chicago advertising firm where success meant sacrificing everything that made life worth living, burnout wasn't just knocking, it had kicked down the door and made itself at home. The panic attacks started small. Sweaty palms during client presentations, heart racing on the morning commute. By the end, I was hyperventilating in bathroom stalls between meetings. Dr. Levinson called it an adjustment disorder with anxiety, but we both knew it was simpler than that. I was dying by small cuts, deadlines, performance reviews, and the crushing sameness of days spent under fluorescent lights. So, when my Uncle Frank passed and left me his cabin on the edge of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, it felt like the universe was throwing me a lifeline. "You're making a mistake," my ex-girlfriend Natalie said when I told her I was leaving. "You're a city boy, Dan. Always have been." But she was wrong. I'd spent childhood summers with Uncle Frank, learning to fish the small creeks that ribboned through the prairie, identifying bird calls at dawn, watching thunderstorms roll across the vast Kansas sky. That was before college, before the career track, before I'd convinced myself that success meant a corner office and a luxury condo. The cabin sat on 20 acres bordering the Z-Bar Ranch portion of the preserve, one of the last remaining tracts of tallgrass prairie in North America. Uncle Frank had been a park ranger there before retirement, and the National Park Service had granted him special permission to keep his modest homestead with the understanding it would revert to them after his death. I'd hired a lawyer who managed to extend the agreement for another 5 years, giving me time to figure out my next steps. "Just don't go native on us," my former boss Martin had joked at my going-away party. "We need you back when you get this nature thing out of your system." I nodded and smiled, but we both knew I wasn't coming back. Something fundamental had broken inside me, and I needed silence to hear the pieces settling. The first month at the cabin was everything I'd hoped for. I established routines around sunrise and sunset rather than meeting schedules. I chopped wood even though it was summer, stockpiling for winter. I hiked the rolling hills, sometimes not seeing another human for days. Cell service was spotty at best, which suited me fine. I'd brought enough books to last a year. It was on one of these hikes, about 5 miles from my cabin, that I first found the hollow. I'd been following game trails, noting how they networked across the landscape like veins. The day was bright but cool for June, with scattered clouds providing occasional relief from the sun. The tall grass swayed around me, some stands reaching well above my waist. Prairie chickens burst from cover as I approached, startling me with their sudden flutter. Meadowlarks perched on swaying stems, their yellow breasts bright against the green and gold landscape. I crested a small rise, and there it was, a perfect circular depression in the earth, maybe 30 feet across. The grass inside the hollow was different, darker, more lush. I checked my GPS. I was still within the preserve boundaries, but in an area seldom visited by tourists who typically stuck to the established trails near the historic ranch buildings. Something about the hollow made the hairs on my neck stand up. It was too perfect, too deliberate-looking to be natural. I took a step inside the perimeter and immediately felt a temperature drop, as if I'd walked into a refrigerated room. In the Kansas summer heat, the cool air was welcome, but disconcerting. I knelt and touched the grass. It felt wet, though there'd been no rain for days. Looking more closely, I noticed something odd about the soil where my fingers had brushed aside the grass. It was almost black, not the rich brown typical of prairie soil. And there was something else. Tiny white filaments, like roots but finer, networked through the soil. I stood up, suddenly uncomfortable. The hollow felt watchful, as if the very air was assessing me. A ridiculous thought, but I couldn't shake it. I took pictures with my phone, intending to ask the park rangers about this geological anomaly on my next visit to the preserve headquarters. As I turned to leave, I noticed something half buried at the center of the hollow. Walking over, I saw it was a small animal skull. A rabbit, I thought, though it seemed misshapen somehow. I was about to pick it up when a voice called out, "I wouldn't touch that if I were you." I spun around to see a woman standing at the edge of the hollow. She was in her 60s, perhaps, with weather-beaten skin and silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore hiking clothes, practical pants with many pockets, a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. "You gave me a fright," I said, hand to my chest. "I didn't hear you approach." "No one ever does," she said, her voice flat. "Not in this place." Something about her tone sent another chill through me. "Do you know what this place is?" I asked, gesturing at the hollow. She didn't answer directly. "You're the nephew, the one living in Frank Mercer's cabin." It wasn't a question. "Yes, I'm Daniel. Did you know my uncle?" Everyone knew Frank. She took a step forward but remained outside the hollow's perimeter. He knew enough to stay away from this place. I felt a flicker of irritation. I'd come out here for solitude, not cryptic warnings from strangers. "And you are?" "Eleanor Wilkes. I've lived on the other side of the preserve for 40 years. She pointed vaguely eastward. "Frank and I served on the conservation committee together." The name rang a bell. Uncle Frank had mentioned her in his letters, a retired botanist who'd moved to the area to study the unique prairie ecosystem. My irritation faded. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Wilkes. I remember Uncle Frank mentioning your work." She acknowledged this with a slight nod. "You need to leave this place, Mr. Mercer, and don't come back." Because nothing good ever came from this hollow." She glanced at the sky, which had begun to darken with afternoon thunderclouds. "Storm's coming. You should head back." She turned and started walking away through the tall grass. "Wait," I called after her. "What is this place? Some kind of sinkhole?" She stopped but didn't turn around. "Ask at the visitor center if you're curious. Ask about the Kaw tribe legends. Ask about the settler family that disappeared in 1873. Ask why this section of the preserve isn't on any of the public maps. Then she continued walking and was soon lost from sight in the waving grass. I looked back at the hollow, suddenly less eager to linger. The darkening sky and rising wind urged me homeward. As I stepped out of the depression, I could have sworn I felt resistance, like wading through water. Probably just the thicker grass, I told myself. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I made my way back to the cabin, thoughts churning. The encounter with Dr. Wilkes had been strange, but living alone on the prairie probably made anyone a bit eccentric. Still, her warning nagged at me. Back at the cabin, I fired up my laptop and checked my offline map archives. She was right. The area where I'd found the hollow wasn't marked on any of the public trail maps, despite being well within the preserve's boundaries. On a whim, I dug out some of Uncle Frank's old papers that I'd boxed up but hadn't yet gone through thoroughly. After an hour of searching, I found a hand-drawn map of the preserve from what looked like the 1980s. There, in faded pencil, was a small circle marked in the approximate location of the hollow I'd found. Next to it, in my uncle's neat handwriting, was a single word: avoid. The storm hit just before sunset, a proper Kansas thunderstorm that made the cabin's timbers creak and groan. Rain lashed against the windows as lightning split the sky, momentarily turning night to day. In those flashes, the prairie beyond my porch looked alien and hostile, the tall grass thrashing like a living thing in the wind. I sat by the fireplace with a glass of Uncle Frank's whiskey, thinking about the hollow and Eleanor Wilkes's warning. Part of me, the rational city-dweller part, dismissed it as local superstition. The other part, the part that had always been drawn to this wild place, wasn't so sure. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, my dreams were filled with whispering grass and a darkness that breathed. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the way it always does after a good storm. I decided to visit the preserve's visitor center to see what I could learn about the hollow. The main complex was about 3 miles from my cabin, an easy hike across terrain I now knew well. The Z-Bar Ranch Visitor Center was housed in a restored limestone barn that had stood since the 1880s. Inside, interpretive displays told the story of the tallgrass ecosystem and the human history of the Flint Hills region. A few early tourists wandered among the exhibits or watched the orientation film in the small theater. I found a ranger at the information desk, a young man named Tyler with an eager smile and a fresh-pressed uniform. When I asked about unusual geological features in the preserve, his enthusiasm was palpable. "Oh man, we've got some awesome karst formations. Limestone caves, sinks, you name it. Are you interested in geology?" "Sort of," I said. "I found this strange circular depression yesterday about 5 miles northwest of here. Perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across. The grass inside is different." Tyler's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that's probably just a buffalo wallow. The bison create these depressions by rolling and dusting. It changes the soil composition." But there was something in his hesitation that told me he knew exactly what I was talking about. "This didn't look like a wallow," I pressed. "The temperature dropped inside it. And I met a woman there, Dr. Eleanor Wilkes. She suggested there might be some local legends about the place." At the mention of Wilkes, Tyler's professional demeanor cracked further. He glanced toward an office door behind the counter. "Hold on a second," he said, then disappeared through the door. A minute later, an older man emerged. His ranger uniform was worn at the edges, his face deeply tanned and lined. The name badge on his chest read, "Richard Blackwood, Chief Ranger." "I understand you're asking about the hollow," he said without preamble. "Yes, I found it yesterday while hiking." "You're Frank Mercer's nephew." Again, not a question. Word travels fast around here. A ghost of a smile. Small community. He gestured toward a door. "Let's talk in my office." I followed him into a small room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. A topographical map of the preserve covered one wall, with various areas marked in different colors. I noticed a small red circle in the approximate location of the hollow. Blackwood sat behind his desk and motioned me to a chair. "How much did Eleanor tell you?" "Not much, just to ask about Kaw legends and a settler family that disappeared." He nodded slowly. "Eleanor's protective of that place in her way, wants people to stay clear, but doesn't like to spread the stories herself." He leaned back in his chair. "The hollow has been here longer than written records. The Kaw people called it the breath of bad spirits and kept well away from it. When European settlers arrived, they initially ignored these warnings. The family that disappeared? The Hendersons. Thomas Henderson brought his wife and 3 children from Pennsylvania in 1872, built a small homestead right near where your uncle's cabin now stands. In the spring of 1873, they vanished. The house was found abandoned, food still on the table, belongings untouched. No signs of violence, no tracks leading away. Just gone." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm office. "And they think this hollow had something to do with it?" Blackwood shrugged. "The Kaw said the bad spirits took them for building too close. Later, settlers avoided the area for decades after that. When the National Preserve was established, that section was deliberately left off public maps." He fixed me with a steady gaze. "There have been other incidents over the years, nothing as dramatic as an entire family disappearing, but enough to make us cautious." "What kind of incidents?" He hesitated. "Hikers getting disoriented, strange animal behavior, people reporting lost time. We've had visitors who swear they spent only an hour in that area, but when they check their watches, an entire afternoon has passed." He paused. "And there are the dreams." "Dreams?" "People who spend time near the hollow often report unusual dreams. Vivid, disturbing, always involving the prairie talking to them somehow." The whispers from my own dream last night suddenly felt more significant. "You believe all this?" Another measured pause. "I believe there are things in this world we don't fully understand, Mr. Mercer. I've been working this land for 30 years, and I've seen enough to keep an open mind." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a file, opening it to reveal a black and white photograph. This was taken in 1957 by a University of Kansas research team. The photo showed the hollow from above, seemingly taken from a hill overlooking it. Even in the grainy image, the perfect circularity was evident. But what caught my attention was a dark figure standing at its center, humanoid but oddly proportioned, too tall and thin. "What is that?" I asked, pointing to the figure. The research team claimed there was no one in the hollow when the picture was taken. Blackwood closed the file. "Look, I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just sharing the history. Your Uncle Frank respected these stories enough to keep his distance from that place, despite being one of the most rational men I've ever known." I thought about the note on Uncle Frank's map. Avoid. "Thank you for being candid," I said. "Do you think it's dangerous?" "I think it's unpredictable," Blackwood replied carefully. "And in my experience, unpredictable things in nature deserve respect." He stood, indicating our conversation was over. "Your uncle was a good friend and a valuable member of this community. I'd hate to see anything happen to his nephew." As I left the visitor center, my mind was crowded with questions. Part of me, the logical, city-trained part, wanted to dismiss these stories as rural superstition. But another part, perhaps the part that had drawn me to this wild place to begin with, wasn't so quick to judge. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my routine, chopping wood, tending my small garden, reading on the porch as the sun set behind the rolling hills. But my thoughts kept returning to the hollow, the skull I'd almost touched, the temperature drop, Eleanor Wilkes' warning, the Henderson family that vanished without a trace. And each night the dreams came. I'd find myself walking through tall grass that whispered my name in a voice just below the threshold of understanding. Sometimes I'd glimpse something moving through the grass ahead of me, something tall and thin that never quite revealed itself, I'd wake, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat despite the cabin's coolness. After a week of this, I knew I needed to return to the hollow. Not out of bravery, but because the dreams wouldn't stop until I did. This time, I went prepared. Compass, GPS, full water bottle, first aid kit, flashlight though I planned to be back well before dark. I even left a note on my kitchen table stating where I was going. In case. The day was overcast, unusual for Kansas in June. The clouds hung low, creating a strange, diffused light that flattened shadows and made distances hard to judge. The tall grass seemed more imposing than before, closing behind me as I walked as if erasing my path. I found the hollow exactly where I'd left it, the perfect circle unmistakable among the random patterns of the prairie. Standing at its perimeter, I felt again that sense of being watched, assessed. The darker grass inside swayed slightly, though I felt no breeze. "I knew you'd come back." I jumped at the voice. Eleanor Wilkes stood a few yards away, her expression grim beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "You startled me again," I said, heart hammering. "Do you always move so quietly?" "The prairie teaches you how to walk if you listen long enough." She came closer, keeping a respectful distance from the hollow's edge. "The dreams started, didn't they?" I stared at her. "How did you know?" "It's always the same. The hollow calls, and people answer." She sighed heavily. "I've been studying this place for 30 years, Mr. Mercer. I've documented every anomaly, every incident, every strange occurrence. I've taken soil samples, monitored temperature fluctuations, recorded electromagnetic readings that would make your scientific friends in Chicago scratch their heads. You know I'm from Chicago." A dismissive wave. "Everyone knows your story. Small community, remember? The point is, I've applied every scientific method I know to this phenomenon, and I'm no closer to understanding it than the Ka were centuries ago." She looked at the hollow with something like resignation. Some things defy conventional explanation. "Then why are you here now?" I asked. "The same reason I'm always here, to keep watch, to warn people away when I can." "You're protecting the hollow?" She snorted. "No, Mr. Mercer. I'm protecting people from the hollow, or trying to." She nodded toward the depression. "You notice the mushrooms yet?" I looked more carefully. Amid the darker grass, small white mushrooms formed a perfect circle following the hollow's circumference. "A fairy ring," I murmured. "That's what Europeans called them. Places where the fair folk danced at night. Other cultures have different names, different explanations, but always the same recognition, a boundary between worlds." Despite myself, I shivered. "You're saying this is some kind of portal?" "I'm saying there are thin places in the world, Mr. Mercer. Places where whatever separates us from elsewhere isn't as robust as we might hope." She glanced at the darkening sky. "Another storm coming. They always seem to gather around this place." As if on cue, thunder rumbled in the distance. "You should go home," she continued. "The hollow is more active during storms." "More active? What does that mean exactly?" Instead of answering, she pointed to the center of the hollow. "The skull you almost touched last time. It's gone now, isn't it?" I looked. She was right. The small animal skull that had caught my attention on my first visit was no longer there. "The hollow takes and it gives," Eleanor said cryptically. "Never the same thing, never with any pattern I can discern. But always with purpose." Another roll of thunder, closer now. Wind began to pick up, making the tall grass sway and hiss. "Go home, Mr. Mercer. If the dreams still come, call me." She handed me a card with a phone number written in neat script. "I can't stop them, but I can tell you what to expect next." She turned to leave, then paused. "Your uncle lived a long, happy life here because he respected the boundaries. The Hendersons didn't. Remember that." As she walked away, swallowed quickly by the waving grass, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The smart move would be to follow her advice and head back to the cabin immediately, but something held me there. A compulsion to understand, to witness, to know. I stood at the edge of the hollow, rain beginning to soak through my jacket, watching the dark grass within the circle. Was it my imagination, or was the grass moving differently than the tall grass around it, swaying to a rhythm unrelated to the wind? Lightning flashed, momentarily turning the world stark white. In that frozen instant, I thought I saw something standing in the center of the hollow, a tall, thin figure with limbs too long for its torso. But when my vision cleared, there was nothing there but waving grass. Thunder crashed directly overhead, making me flinch. The storm had arrived with startling speed, now directly above me. Rain fell in sheets, and the wind howled across the prairie. I needed to get back to the cabin. I turned to leave, but as I took my first step away from the hollow, a voice froze me in place. Daniel. It wasn't Eleanor. It wasn't any human voice I'd ever heard. It was the wind, the grass, the rain, the thunder, all speaking my name in unison. Daniel Mercer. I turned slowly back toward the hollow. The rain was falling everywhere except within the perfect circle, where the dark grass remained eerily dry. At the center stood a figure. It had the basic shape of a man, but wrong in a way that made my mind recoil. Too tall by half, limbs like bent willow branches, fingers that extended far too long. Its face, if it could be called a face, was smooth and featureless save for two deep indentations where eyes should be. "You hear us," the thing said, its voice a chorus of whispers. Few do anymore. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Fear had turned my blood to ice, my muscles to stone. What are you?" I managed to gasp. "We are the first." The thing tilted its head at an impossible angle. Before the grass, before the bison, before the people. We were here. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant, I saw not one figure but dozens, hundreds, all identical, all standing in the same spot, overlapping yet distinct, as if the thing existed in many places, many times simultaneously. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm. "To be remembered," it replied. "To be honored, as we once were." "The Caw," I said, remembering Blackwood's words. "They knew about you. They brought offerings. They listened. They respected the boundaries." The thing took a step forward, still within the hollow. Then others came, built, plowed, fenced, forgot. Another step. It was almost at the edge of the hollow now. "The Henderson family," I said. "Did you take them?" The thing's head swiveled in a way no human neck could move. "They built on sacred ground. They cut the tall grass. They refused to hear. And you—" "What? Killed them?" "We showed them the truth. Some minds cannot bear it." Thunder boomed so loudly I felt it in my chest. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets now. I should run, get back to the cabin, to safety. But I remained rooted to the spot, transfixed by the impossible thing before me. "Why are you showing yourself to me?" I asked. "You hear us in your dreams. You seek understanding, like the silver-haired one." "Eleanor, she's seen you too?" "She watches. She listens. She warns others away." The thing's head tilted again. "But she does not understand. Cannot understand. And I can?" "Your blood remembers. Your uncle's blood. Before him, the one you call Henderson. Before him, the Caw chief who communed with us." A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran through me. "What are you saying?" "Lineage matters. Connections echo through time." The thing raised one impossibly long arm, pointing a finger that seemed to elongate as it extended toward me. "We have waited for one who can hear, who can speak for us." Lightning struck somewhere very close, the thunder immediate and deafening. In the electric brightness I saw the thing's face change, shifting to resemble something almost human, with features that horrifyingly reminded me of my own. "No," I said, finally finding the strength to step backward. "I don't want any part of this." "You already are part," the chorus of whispers replied. "You have always been part. Why do you think you were drawn here? Why do you think your uncle left you the cabin? Why do you think the dreams find you so easily?" My back hit something solid. Spinning around, I found myself facing another of the creatures, this one standing outside the hollow's perimeter. Somehow, impossible as it seemed, it had gotten behind me. "Jesus Christ," I gasped, scrambling sideways away from both entities. "Newer gods," the thing behind me said dismissively. "They have no power here. This place was sacred long before such names were spoken." I turned to run, but the tall grass around me had grown impossibly high, forming a wall that cut off escape in all directions. The hollow and the two entities were the only clear space left. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. "Recognition," said the first entity. "Respect," said the second. Their voices merged as they spoke the third word. "Restoration." "I don't understand," I said, rain streaming down my face, heart hammering against my ribs. "The balance is broken," they said in unison. "The tall grass dwindles. The boundaries thin. That which was contained begins to wander." A horrifying thought struck me. "You're trapped here, in the hollow." Not trapped, anchored, by agreement with those who came first among men. We stay within the circle. They keep the tall grass sacred. The creatures' voices took on a harder edge. But the agreement was broken. The tall grass was cut, plowed under, replaced with short-rooted crops that do not hear, do not speak, do not remember. I remembered what I knew about the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, one of the last remaining tracts of tallgrass prairie in North America. Once, this ecosystem had covered 170 million acres of the continent. Now, less than 4% remained. "The preserve," I said, "it's protecting what's left. Too little, too late, the boundaries fail. We begin to wander." Lightning struck again, closer than ever. In the flash, I saw beyond the two entities before me, saw across the prairie to other hollows, other circles, other thin places where more of these things were emerging. Dozens of them, hundreds, stretching across the landscape. "Oh, God," I whispered. "You understand now," the things said, their voices a rising chorus that matched the howling wind. "The end of the tall grass means the end of the boundaries. We cannot be contained by fences and laws and preserved boundaries. We require the old ways, the old agreements." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, rain mixing with tears of terror on my face. "Become the speaker. Renew the covenant. Bring the offerings. Restore what was." What offerings? What covenant? But the entities were already fading, becoming translucent as the storm reached its peak intensity around us. The last thing I heard before they disappeared entirely was a whispered promise that chilled me more than the rain ever could. "We will show you in dreams." I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. My memories of that walk are fragmented. Flashes of lightning, the roar of thunder, the tall grass whipping against my legs as I ran blindly through the storm. By the time I reached the porch, I was soaked to the bone and shaking uncontrollably, as much from fear as from cold. Inside, I stripped off my wet clothes and wrapped myself in blankets, but the chill seemed to have penetrated to my very core. I built a fire in the hearth, poured a generous measure of whiskey, and tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. Had it been real, or some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation, by the power of suggestion after hearing the local legends? The rational part of my mind, the city part, the part that had thrived in boardrooms and believed in quarterly reports and focus groups, insisted it couldn't have been real, but another part knew better. I found myself rifling through Uncle Frank's papers again, searching for any mention of the hollow, any hint that he'd experienced something similar. After hours of searching, I found a journal hidden in a false bottom of his old desk drawer. The entries were sporadic, starting from when he'd first moved to the cabin 30 years ago. The early entries were mundane, observations about wildlife, weather patterns, preserve business. But then, about a year into his time here, the tone changed. June 18, 1991, found a strange circular depression about 5 miles in W of the cabin today. Perfect circle, about 30 ft across. Unusual vegetation inside. Temperature noticeably cooler within the circle. We'll ask Richard about it tomorrow. June 20th, 1991. Richard says to stay away from the circle. Says there are stories about it. Not like Richard to be superstitious. Need to investigate further. June 25th, 1991. Dreams again last night. Voices in the grass. Something watching me from the circle. This is getting concerning. The entries continued, documenting increasingly vivid dreams and a growing obsession with the hollow. Then, abruptly, they stopped for several months. When they resumed, Uncle Frank's handwriting had changed, become shakier, less certain. February 12, 1992. 3 months since the incident at the hollow. Dr. Schaefer says the memory loss may be permanent. Eleanor visits daily, though she won't tell me exactly what happened. Says it's better I don't remember. The dreams have stopped, at least. The remaining entries never mentioned the hollow again, focusing instead on preserve business, community matters, and wildlife observations. It was as if Uncle Frank had made a deliberate decision to excise that part of his experience from his written record. I closed the journal, hands trembling. What had happened to Uncle Frank at the hollow? What incident had caused his memory loss? And why had Eleanor Wilkes been involved? Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the entities from the hollow, heard their chorus of whispers promising to show me more in dreams. I kept the lights on until dawn, when exhaustion finally overcame fear. When I finally slept, the dreams came as promised. But they weren't the vague, unsettling dreams of before. These were vivid, detailed visions that felt more like memories than dreams. I saw the prairie as it once was, a vast ocean of grass stretching to every horizon, unbroken by roads or fences or towns. I saw the first people arrive, encounter the entities in their hollows, and establish a covenant through blood and song and offering. I saw the balance maintained for generations, the hollows respected, the boundaries strong. Then I saw the change. New people with plows and fences, cutting into the earth, tearing up the tall grass by its roots. I saw the boundaries weakening, the entities growing restless. I saw violence, settlers vanishing, strange occurrences, inexplicable deaths. And then I saw my own lineage, my connection to this place that went deeper than Uncle Frank, deeper than I had ever known. I saw my ancestor among the first European settlers, making a separate peace with the entities. I saw Uncle Frank renewing that covenant in his own way before something went wrong. I woke, gasping, the morning sun streaming through my window. The dream had lasted all night, yet I felt no rest. My mind buzzed with images, knowledge, understanding that hadn't been there before. I knew what I had to do. The card Eleanor had given me was still in my jacket pocket. I dialed the number with shaking fingers. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "You've seen them," she said without preamble. "Yes." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "And I've dreamed. I know what they want." A long silence. Then, "What did they show you?" "Everything. The covenant. The boundaries. My connection to this place." Another pause. "I've studied the hollow for 30 years, Mr. Mercer. I've seen the entities 3 times, but they've never spoken to me. Never shown me what they've shown you in a single encounter." "Because of my bloodline," I said, the words feeling both foreign and true. My ancestor was Thomas Henderson, the settler who disappeared with his family. They didn't disappear. Not exactly. They were shown the truth, like the entities told me. His wife and children couldn't bear it. Their minds broke. But Thomas adapted, made a new covenant, became their speaker. And your uncle? Frank never told me exactly what happened to him at the Hollow. I closed my eyes, seeing the truth that had been revealed in my dreams. He tried to renew the covenant after the previous speaker died, but he wasn't prepared. It overwhelmed him. You found him, didn't you? Unconscious at the edge of the Hollow. Yes, Eleanor admitted. He was in a coma for 3 days. When he woke, he had no memory of what happened. I thought it was a blessing at the time. It was protection, I said. The entities took those memories to preserve his sanity, but they kept waiting for the next speaker. For me. What will you do now? Eleanor asked, her voice tight with concern. I looked out my window at the tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. What I have to do, what I was meant to do. Restore the covenant, strengthen the boundaries. How? I need to go to the visitor center first. Talk to Ranger Blackwood. There are records I need to see. The original land surveys, the Kaw oral histories that were recorded by anthropologists in the 1950s. And then? I thought of the entity's words. Become the speaker. Renew the covenant. Bring the offerings. Restore what was. I need to make an offering at the Hollow, I said, surprised by my own certainty. Under the new moon, 3 nights from now. Daniel, wait. Eleanor's voice turned urgent. Your uncle nearly died. The Henderson family was destroyed. Whatever you're planning, I know the risks, I interrupted. But I also know what happens if I do nothing. You've seen them, Eleanor. You know they're breaking free of the Hollows. What happens when they can no longer be contained? When they wander freely through towns and cities, showing people the truth that human minds aren't equipped to handle. The silence on the other end told me she had considered this possibility. Come to my house this afternoon, she finally said. Bring your uncle's journal. There are things you need to know before you make any decisions. She gave me directions to her home on the eastern edge of the preserve and hung up. I sat holding the silent phone, wondering what other revelations waited for me. Eleanor Wilkes lived in a modest limestone farmhouse that looked like it had stood for a century. Gardens surrounded it, not ornamental ones, but what appeared to be carefully organized research plots with different species of prairie plants. She met me at the door, her expression guarded. Come in, Mr. Mercer. The interior was what I'd expect from a retired academic. Bookshelves everywhere, papers stacked on every surface, scientific equipment sharing space with coffee mugs. One entire wall was covered with photographs and notes about the Hollow. You've been studying it for decades, I observed, examining the meticulous documentation. Trying to understand it, she corrected, setting a kettle on the stove, with limited success. I handed her Uncle Frank's journal. You should read this. While she paged through it, I examined her wall of research. Photographs of the Hollow taken in different seasons, at different times of day. Soil analyses, temperature readings, charts tracking various phenomena, animal disappearances, strange weather patterns, visitor reports, all correlated with lunar cycles and seasons. Your uncle never told me exactly what happened to him that night, Eleanor said when she finished reading. When I found him, he was catatonic. 3 days in the hospital, and when he woke, he had no memory of the event, but he knew enough to stay away from the Hollow afterward. The entities say they took his memories to protect him, I said. They show themselves fully only to those of a certain bloodline. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. What else did they tell you? I related everything I'd experienced at the Hollow and the dreams that followed. As I spoke, she took notes, occasionally interjecting with questions that revealed her scientific mind working to categorize and understand. This covenant, she said when I'd finished, what exactly does it entail? An exchange, I explained. The entities remain bound to their hollows, maintaining the boundaries between worlds, I suppose. In return, they receive recognition, offerings, respect. Offerings of what? The Ka legends mention blood sacrifice. I shook my head. Not as we understand it. The offerings are symbolic, representations of what the land provides. Seeds from the tall grass, water from the creeks, small personal items that connect the speaker to the human world. She looked skeptical. And you believe this will, what? Keep these entities contained? Prevent them from wandering beyond the prairie? I believe the balance has been disrupted by the destruction of the tall grass ecosystem. These entities have existed here for thousands, maybe millions of years. They're as much a part of this place as the soil and the grass itself. I met her gaze steadily, and yes, I believe that renewing the covenant through a speaker of the right bloodline is the only way to restore that balance. Eleanor turned to look at her research wall, at 30 years of scientific inquiry that had brought her no closer to understanding the Hollow's true nature. I've seen too much to discount your experience entirely, she admitted, but I've also seen what happens to people who get too close to that place. She turned back to me. If you're determined to do this, at least let me help prepare you. For the rest of the afternoon, Eleanor shared everything she knew about the Hollow. Its patterns of activity correlated with lunar cycles, with heightened phenomena during the new moon. The areas where the tall grass had been most completely preserved had fewer reports of wandering entities. The Ka rituals that anthropologists had documented, which included a ceremonial approach from the east, specific offerings, and protective measures for the speaker. The Ka shaman would prepare for days before approaching the Hollow, she explained. Fasting, purification rituals, protective totems. Whatever these entities are, the Ka understood they were dangerous. By the time I left Eleanor's house, the sun was setting over the prairie. We had agreed that she would help me prepare for the ritual at the Hollow 3 nights hence, when the new moon would darken the sky. I still think this is dangerous foolishness, she said as I was leaving. But if you're right about your connection to this place, perhaps you have a chance of succeeding where others have failed. As I hiked back to my cabin through the darkening prairie, I felt the weight of what I was undertaking. I had come to Kansas seeking escape from the artificial pressures of my former life, only to find myself bound to this place by ties of blood and history I'd never suspected. The tall grass whispered around me as I walked, and for the first time, I tried to listen, really listen to what it might be saying. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. I spent hours at the preserve's archives with Ranger Blackwood, who, after initial skepticism, provided access to the historical records I sought. The original land surveys from the 1870s showed several circular depressions across the Flint Hills region, all carefully marked and annotated with warnings. The transcribed Ka oral histories spoke of the people beneath the grass and the rituals used to keep them satisfied. I found survey records from Thomas Henderson's original homestead, confirming it had been built directly over one of these depressions, a fact that surely contributed to the family's fate. My own cabin, I discovered, stood precisely at the boundary of what the Ka had considered safe distance from the Hollow. Eleanor helped me prepare the offerings: seeds collected from 7 different tall grass species, water from Spring Hill Creek, known for its mineral content, a small silver pin that had belonged to my mother, connecting me to my family line, and a few drops of my own blood, collected in a small clay bowl Eleanor had fashioned for the purpose. The Ka believed that blood was the carrier of spirit, she explained as she worked the clay. A few drops freely given connected the speaker to the entities in a way that allowed communication without the dangers of full exposure. On the morning of the new moon, Eleanor came to my cabin with a leather pouch containing herbs. Sweet grass, sage, and prairie juniper, she said. Burn them tonight before you approach the Hollow. The Ka used them for protection. You don't have to come tonight, I told her. In fact, it might be safer if you don't. After 30 years studying this phenomenon, you think I'd miss the opportunity to witness a genuine covenant renewal? She shook her head. I'll keep my distance, but I'll be there. As the day wore on, I found myself growing calmer rather than more anxious. The dreams of the past 2 nights had been different. Not frightening, but instructive, showing me exactly what to do, what to say. It was as if some ancestral memory was awakening within me, guiding me toward a role my bloodline had been fulfilling for generations. By sunset, I had gathered everything I needed. The offering pouch hung at my belt. The smoldering herbs filled the cabin with their sharp, clean scent. I changed into clothes Eleanor had helped me prepare, simple cotton pants and shirt, but adorned with symbols taken from Kaw designs that the anthropological record suggested had protective properties. As I stepped out onto my porch, the prairie stretched before me in the last light of day, the tall grass golden and swaying. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering again, though the weather report had predicted clear skies. "They're coming for the ceremony," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Eleanor climbing the porch steps, her eyes on the distant storm. She carried a walking stick and wore practical hiking clothes with a small backpack. "I thought we were meeting at the Hollow," I said. "Changed my mind. Thought you might like the company on the walk." She handed me a walking stick of my own, a sturdy piece of oak carved with symbols similar to those on my clothes. "For crossing the boundary," she explained. We set off across the darkening prairie, the first stars appearing overhead where the gathering clouds hadn't yet obscured them. Neither of us spoke much as we walked. I was focused inward, mentally preparing for what was to come. Eleanor, I suspected, was still conflicted about the entire enterprise, but too scientifically curious to stay away. The hollow looked different as we approached in the twilight. The darker grass within its perfect circle seemed to absorb what little light remained, creating a pool of shadow amid the swaying tall grass. The white mushrooms that formed its perimeter glowed faintly, providing the only clear indication of its boundary. "I'll stay here," Eleanor said, stopping about 20 yards from the edge. "Close enough to observe, far enough to—" She hesitated. "Run if things go wrong," I suggested with a grim smile. "Maintain objectivity," she corrected firmly. "Go on then. Everything as we discussed." I approached the hollow's edge as the last light faded from the sky and the new moon left the world in darkness. The storm clouds had surrounded us now, though they remained distant, flashing with internal lightning but releasing no rain or wind yet. Standing at the perimeter, I removed my shoes as the Ka rituals instructed, feeling the cool earth beneath my feet. I lit a small bundle of the herbs Eleanor had provided, letting the smoke drift over me and into the hollow. Then, taking a deep breath, I stepped across the boundary for the 3rd time. The temperature drop was immediate and more pronounced than before. The sounds of the prairie, insects, distant birds, the rustle of grass, ceased abruptly. I walked to the center of the depression, feeling the strange resistance, as if moving through water rather than air. At the center, I knelt and opened the pouch of offerings. One by one, I placed them on the dark soil. The seeds, the vial of creek water, my mother's silver pin. Finally, I took the small clay bowl and pricked my finger with a sterilized needle, allowing 3 drops of blood to fall into it. "I come as the speaker," I said, the words feeling ancient in my mouth. "I come to renew the covenant between your people and mine." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the darkness at the center of the hollow seemed to deepen, to coalesce into a form I now recognized, the impossibly tall, thin entity with its 2 long limbs and featureless face. "Speaker," it acknowledged, its voice still that unsettling chorus of whispers. "You have come as promised." "I have brought the offerings," I said, gesturing to the items before me. "Seeds of the tall grass that binds us, water from the springs that sustain us, silver from the earth that grounds us, blood of my line that connects us." More of the entities began to appear, first as shadows within shadows, then taking on more defined form until they surrounded me in a circle, a dozen or more of the impossible beings. "The covenant has been broken," they said in unison. "The tall grass dies. The boundaries fail. We begin to wander." "I seek to restore what was," I replied, following the words that had come to me in dreams. "To honor the agreement made by those who came before. To rebuild the boundaries that protect both our kinds." A wind had begun to circle within the hollow, though the tall grass beyond its boundary remained still. The entities swayed slightly, as if moved by currents I couldn't perceive. "Why should we trust the words of men?" they asked. "Your kind promised before. Your kind failed before." "Because I am of the line of Thomas Henderson, who saw the truth and survived," I answered. "Because I am of the blood of Frank Mercer, who attempted renewal and was spared. Because I hear the tall grass speak, as my ancestors did." The wind increased, circling faster. Above us, the storm clouds had gathered directly overhead, lightning illuminating them from within, but still no rain falling. "The test, then," the entities said, "to prove your worthiness as speaker." I had expected this from my dreams, though what form the test would take remained unclear. I nodded my acceptance. The entity directly before me extended one impossibly long arm, its fingers elongating further until they nearly touched my forehead. "We will show you the truth," it said. "All of it. Not the glimpses your uncle saw, not the fragments your ancestor embraced. The full reality of what we are, what this place is, what existence means beyond the veil your kind has drawn across perception." I understood the danger immediately. This was what had broken the minds of Thomas Henderson's wife and children. This was what had sent my uncle into a catatonic state, requiring the entities to remove the memory entirely to preserve his sanity. But it was also the price of becoming the true speaker. "I accept," I said, closing my eyes as the entity's cold fingers touched my forehead. Reality shattered. I saw the world not as human eyes perceive it, but as it truly exists. Layers upon layers of existence occupying the same space, time flowing not linearly but in complex spirals and loops, matter and energy interchangeable and interpenetrating. I saw the entities as they truly were. Not physical beings at all, but interfaces between dimensions. Nexus points where different planes of reality converged. The hollows were thin spots, places where the barriers between these dimensions had worn away over millennia. The tallgrass prairie, with its deep root systems that plunged up to 15 feet into the earth, had evolved in symbiosis with these convergence points, drawing energy from them while simultaneously anchoring them in place, preventing them from expanding, from allowing too much bleed-through between realities that were never meant to fully touch. I saw the catastrophe that was slowly unfolding as the tall grass vanished, the boundaries weakening, the hollows expanding, the entities wandering, not because they chose to, but because the anchors that held their dimensional interfaces in place were disappearing. Left unchecked, the process would eventually lead to a complete collapse of the barriers between dimensions, with consequences for human civilization that defied comprehension. I saw, too, my own place in this vast pattern. How my bloodline had somehow evolved the rare capacity to perceive these truths without the immediate psychological destruction that affected others. How Thomas Henderson had accidentally discovered this capacity when he built on a hollow, how the knowledge had been passed down, how Uncle Frank had tried to assume the role of speaker but lacked the full genetic predisposition necessary. And I saw what was required of me. Not a one-time ritual, but a lifetime commitment to this place, to the preservation of what remained of the tall grass, to the maintenance of boundaries that most humans would never know existed. When the vision finally released me, I found myself on my knees in the hollow, gasping for breath. My entire body trembled and tears streamed down my face, but my mind, while forever altered, remained intact. The entities still surrounded me, watching with their eyeless faces. "You have seen," they said. "You have understood. Do you still accept the role of speaker?" I looked down at my hands, which seemed at once familiar and strange after what I'd witnessed. What they were asking was enormous. To give up my former life entirely, to bind myself to this place, to commit to a duty most would consider madness. "I accept," I said, my voice steady despite everything. "I will be the speaker. I will maintain the covenant. I will protect the boundaries." A sound rose from the entities. Not quite a cheer, not quite a sigh, but something between the two. The wind within the hollow rose to a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. "The covenant is renewed," they declared. "The speaker is recognized. The boundaries will hold, so long as you fulfill your duties." "What must I do?" I asked, though I already knew much from the vision. "Live at the edge, where they built before. Protect what remains of the tall grass. Bring the offerings at each turning of the moon. Speak for us to your kind, as you speak for your kind to us." Lightning flashed overhead, and in its momentary brightness, I saw something extraordinary. The tall grass outside the hollow bending inward, forming patterns that echoed the entity's forms, as if the entire prairie was acknowledging the renewed covenant. "It is done," the entities said, already beginning to fade. "Until the next turning of the moon, speaker." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the hollow with my offerings, except for the blood, which had vanished from the clay bowl. On legs that felt simultaneously leaden and insubstantial, I rose and made my way to the edge of the hollow. As I crossed the boundary, sound rushed back, the hum of insects, the distant rumble of thunder, and a human voice calling my name. "Daniel! Daniel, are you all right?" Eleanor was hurrying toward me, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she ran. She reached me just as my legs gave out, and she caught me before I could fall. "My God, you're freezing," she said, wrapping an emergency blanket around my shoulders. "What happened? You were in there for hours." Hours? It had felt like minutes, or perhaps eternity. "Almost 3 hours," she confirmed. "I was about to come in after you when I saw you moving toward the edge." She studied my face anxiously. "You look different." I imagine I did. I felt different, fundamentally changed by what I'd seen, what I now understood. The world would never look the same to me again. "It worked," I told her. "The covenant is renewed. The boundaries will hold." I looked up at the storm clouds, which were already beginning to disperse. "But there's more to do. So much more." "Tell me on the way back," she said, helping me to my feet. "You need warmth, food, rest." As we walked away from the hollow, I glanced back once. In the faint starlight now filtering through the breaking clouds, I thought I saw figures standing at the hollow's perimeter, watching, waiting, bound once more by an agreement as old as the tall grass itself. 1 year later, I sit on the porch of my cabin, no longer Uncle Frank's cabin, but truly mine now, watching the summer sunset paint the tall grass in gold and amber. A cup of hot tea steams beside me, and on my lap rests the journal where I record my observations, much as Uncle Frank once did. The past year has transformed me in ways I'm still discovering. The role of speaker between worlds carries both burden and privilege. Once a month, at the turning of the moon, I visit not just the hollow where it all began, but the 6 others I've located within the preserve. I bring the offerings, I renew the boundaries, I listen to what the entities, what I now understand to be nexus points between dimensions, have to tell me. Eleanor continues her research now with my full cooperation. She'll never see what I've seen. Her mind lacks the specific neurological architecture my bloodline carries, but her scientific approach provides a valuable counterpoint to my more intuitive understanding. Together, we've begun a modest foundation dedicated to tall grass prairie preservation, focusing on key areas where the hollow phenomenon is most concentrated. Ranger Blackwood, once skeptical, has become an ally after witnessing enough to convince him we're onto something important. The preserve has quietly expanded its boundaries to include 3 more hollows that were on private land, using conservation easements and strategic purchases. The dreams continue, but they no longer frighten me. They are communication now, updates from across the dimensional boundary, warnings about weakening points that need attention. Sometimes they show me the past, the Kao shamans who served as speakers before European settlement, the full story of Thomas Henderson's awakening to his role. Sometimes they show possible futures, both the catastrophic one where the boundaries fail entirely and the hopeful one where understanding grows and balance is restored. I've learned that I'm not the only speaker. There are others scattered across the remaining tallgrass regions, in Oklahoma, in Iowa, in Minnesota, each maintaining boundaries in their own territories. We've begun to find each other, to communicate, to coordinate our efforts. Some, like me, came to their role recently. Others are indigenous people whose families have maintained the old knowledge across generations despite everything that was done to erase their cultures. The advertising executive I once was seems like a character in a story I read long ago. My life now has a purpose that no corner office could provide. I am a caretaker of boundaries few know exist, a translator between realities that were never meant to fully touch. The tall grass sways in the evening breeze, whispering secrets only I can fully hear. Beyond it, storm clouds gather over the hollow, right on schedule for tonight's renewal ritual. I finish my tea, gather my prepared offerings, and rise from my chair. The hollow is waiting. The boundaries must be maintained. The covenant continues. And I, Daniel Mercer, speaker between worlds, walk willingly into the growing darkness to meet with those who were here first, and who will remain long after the last human voice falls silent on the prairie. My name is Marcus Whelan, and I am 32 years old. This happened in October 2023. The first signs of dawn were breaking over Canopolis Lake when I finally made the decision to leave the city behind. 3 months after Sarah's funeral, the apartment still felt like a mausoleum. Her coffee mug in the cabinet, her novels stacked on the nightstand, her scent slowly fading from the pillows. Every corporate email, every sympathetic glance from coworkers, every "How are you holding up?" felt like sandpaper on an open wound. I needed silence, space, a reset. Prescribing yourself some wilderness therapy, huh? Dr. Levine had said during our last session. She'd been skeptical but ultimately supportive when I explained my plan to take an extended leave, to hike the remote trails around Canopolis State Park in central Kansas. Just remember, Marcus, grief follows wherever you go. I'd nodded, promised to keep up with my medication, and assured her I'd check in periodically when I had cell service. What I didn't tell her was that I had already sublet my apartment and resigned from my marketing position. This wasn't a vacation. It was an escape. The drive from Kansas City had been long and increasingly desolate, watching the dense urban sprawl give way to endless farmland, and finally to the surprising rugged terrain of Dakota sandstone that few associate with Kansas. Canopolis State Park sits at the edge of the Smoky Hills region, where ancient seabeds pushed up through the earth to form unexpected canyons and bluffs. I pulled my Subaru into the Buffalo Track Canyon trailhead parking lot just as the sun cleared the horizon. The October air was crisp, hovering around 40 degrees, but the forecast promised clear skies and temperatures in the mid-60s by afternoon. Perfect hiking weather. I planned to spend 2 weeks exploring the park's backcountry trails, sleeping in my tent, and hopefully finding some measure of peace in the solitude. After double-checking my pack, tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, 2 weeks of freeze-dried meals, first aid kit, satellite phone for emergencies, I hoisted it onto my shoulders. The weight felt reassuring somehow, a physical reminder that I had prepared for this. I could handle this. The first 5 miles followed Buffalo Track Canyon, a rust-colored gorge carved through sandstone. The trail meandered alongside a gentle creek, winding beneath the shadow of rocky outcroppings. The stillness was immediately striking. No traffic noise, no notifications, no sympathetic voices asking how I was coping. Just the rhythm of my boots on packed earth and the occasional call of a prairie falcon overhead. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached the junction where most day hikers turned back. The maintained trail continued for another 3 miles to Horsethief Canyon, but beyond that were the less traveled paths that local rangers discouraged casual visitors from attempting. Perfect. I paused at the weathered signpost marking the boundary of the more remote territory. A beaten metal placard read, "Notice: trails beyond this point minimally maintained. Experienced hikers only. Register backcountry camping plans at Visitor Center." I had done that, of course. The ranger, a leathery man in his 60s named Dawson, had raised his eyebrows when I told him I planned to spend 2 weeks in the backcountry alone. "That's longer than most folks stay out there," he'd said, studying my face. "You've got backcountry experience?" I'd overstated my qualifications a bit, mentioning weekend trips in Colorado that I'd taken with Sarah. Trips where she had done most of the planning, if I'm being honest. "Well," Dawson had finally said, stamping my permit, "keep to the established paths best you can. Some of those old hunters' trails can peter out without warning. And watch the weather. Flash floods can come through those canyons with no notice." I checked my GPS coordinates and continued past the warning sign, following the trail as it climbed steadily upward. According to my research, there was a secluded camping area near Ferris Caves, a series of man-made caves dug into the sandstone bluffs by early settlers. It seemed like a good place to establish my first camp. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow as it climbed the rocky slope. Several times I had to backtrack when I found myself at dead ends or facing impassable terrain. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when I finally caught sight of the cave entrances carved into the distant bluff face. That's when I felt the first real twinge of unease. It wasn't anything tangible, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness. And though I was still a good half-mile from the caves, I could have sworn I heard the faint echo of laughter? A high, thin sound, almost childlike but somehow wrong. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks. After months of constant noise, hospital machines, funeral arrangements, well-meaning friends, the profound silence was probably just disorienting me. I reached the caves as dusk settled over the landscape. There were 3 main openings carved into the sandstone face, each about the size of a standard doorway. Historical markers nearby explained that these had been hand-dug by a settler named Ferris in the 1880s as shelter from the harsh Kansas weather. The area in front of the caves formed a natural plateau, perfect for camping. I set up my tent about 50 feet from the cave entrances, built a small fire pit ringed with stones, and heated water for my freeze-dried beef stroganoff as darkness fell completely. The stars emerged with startling clarity, more brilliant than I'd ever seen them. With no light pollution for miles, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled silver. For the first time in months, I felt the knot in my chest loosen slightly. Perhaps this had been the right decision after all. I was adding another log to my small fire when I heard it again, that same high, thin laugh echoing from somewhere inside the nearest cave. Then silence. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No response, just the crackling of my fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I retrieved my flashlight from my pack and approached the cave entrance cautiously. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating smooth sandstone walls that extended about 20 feet inward before opening into a wider chamber. "Anyone in here?" I called again, taking a few steps inside. The air felt noticeably cooler, with the slightly musty smell of earth and stone. My light revealed nothing unusual, just an empty chamber with a packed dirt floor and a few old fire rings from previous visitors. As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something on the far wall, what looked like crude drawings scratched into the sandstone. Moving closer, I saw they were indeed petroglyph-style figures, stickmen with elongated limbs, several animals that might have been deer, and what appeared to be a larger figure with an oddly shaped head. Below these, in more recent carving, someone had scratched words into the soft stone. "They come at night." Probably just some teenagers trying to scare visitors, I thought, running my fingers over the scratched letters. The stone felt unusually cold beneath my touch. A sudden gust of wind extinguished my fire outside, sending embers scattering across the ground. I hurried out to rekindle it, telling myself that the unsettled feeling in my stomach was nothing more than hunger and fatigue from the day's hike. After rekindling the fire and finishing my meal, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped considerably with nightfall, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my headlamp as I arranged my sleeping pad. Sleep came surprisingly easily that first night, deep and dreamless. Until 3:17 a.m., when I bolted awake with absolute certainty that someone was standing just outside my tent. I lay perfectly still, heart hammering against my ribs. There was definitely a presence there. A shadow cast against the nylon wall of my tent by the moonlight. It appeared to be the silhouette of a person, unnaturally tall and thin, standing motionless. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. The shadow didn't move, didn't respond. I fumbled for my flashlight and knife, then slowly unzipped the tent flap, prepared to confront whoever was out there. Nothing. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. The fire had died to embers. The caves loomed dark and silent. I did a complete circuit of my campsite, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Not a trace of another person. No footprints in the soft earth near my tent. Nothing disturbed. Sleep was elusive after that. I lay awake until dawn, watching the shadows move across my tent wall as the moon set and listening for any sound of movement outside. Occasionally, I thought I heard that same distant laughter, but it was impossible to pinpoint its direction. When morning finally came, I seriously considered packing up and returning to the main trails, but that felt too much like running away, and hadn't I come here specifically to face my demons rather than flee from them? Besides, one bad night's sleep and an overactive imagination weren't reason enough to abandon my plans. I ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, then decided to properly explore the caves by daylight. The main cave, the one where I'd found the drawings, extended about 30 feet into the bluff before narrowing into a passage too small to follow. The other two caves were similar, though slightly smaller. In the second cave, I found more of the primitive drawings along with modern graffiti from various visitors over the years. Nothing particularly ominous. The third cave, however, felt different. The air inside was noticeably colder, and it descended at a steeper angle. About 15 feet in, the floor dropped away into what appeared to be a natural fissure in the sandstone. Shining my light down, I could see that it extended perhaps another 20 feet before the beam was swallowed by darkness. Some previous visitor had anchored a climbing rope to a sturdy rock outcropping, presumably to explore the lower chamber. My curiosity piqued. I tested the rope. It seemed securely fastened and relatively new. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to see what was below. Using the rope for support, I half climbed, half slid down into the lower section of the cave. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees as I descended. My flashlight revealed a roughly circular chamber about 15 feet across. Unlike the hand-carved upper caves, this appeared to be a natural formation, perhaps created by an ancient underground water source that had long since dried up. What made me freeze, however, were the objects arranged in a precise circle in the center of the chamber. 7 small animal skulls, possibly coyote or fox, positioned to face inward. In the center of the circle lay a leather-bound book, its cover darkened with age and what might have been water damage. Some kind of ritual site? A joke left by previous campers? Either way, it sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Despite every horror movie instinct screaming at me not to touch anything, I approached the circle and knelt to examine the book. Its leather binding was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Carefully opening the cover, I found handwritten text in faded ink. The first page bore a single name: Elias Thorne, 1891. The subsequent pages contained what appeared to be a journal, the handwriting growing increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. I skimmed through it, catching fragments about voices from the stone and the thin ones who walk at night. The final pages contained crude drawings similar to those on the cave walls, along with what looked like mathematical equations or possibly some kind of cipher. The last entry was dated October 31st, 1891. They are coming tonight. I hear them scratching at the walls. The bargain is broken. May God have mercy on my soul. I closed the book, suddenly aware of how cold the chamber had become. My breath clouded heavily in front of my face, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Tucking the journal into my pack, something I now recognize was a terrible mistake, I climbed back up the rope to the relative warmth and light of the upper cave. Outside, the day had turned glorious. Clear blue skies, temperature in the mid-60s, a light breeze rustling through the prairie grasses that grew along the bluff edge. The ominous feeling from the lower chamber seemed absurd in the bright sunlight. I decided to continue my exploration of the area, following a faint trail that wound along the top of the bluff. According to my map, it should eventually connect with Split Boulder Trail, which would take me deeper into the backcountry toward an area known as Alum Creek. The hike that day was spectacular. The trail traced the edge of a series of increasingly dramatic sandstone formations with sweeping views across the prairie. By late afternoon, I'd reached a spot marked on my map as Palmer's Overlook, a jutting promontory that offered panoramic views of the entire valley. I was setting up camp near the overlook when I spotted the hiker. She was perhaps half a mile away, following the same trail I had taken. Even at that distance, I could tell she was moving with the confidence of an experienced trekker. Steady pace, proper gear visible even from afar, an economy of movement that spoke of many miles on the trail. I felt an unexpected surge of both disappointment and relief. Disappointment that my solitude was being interrupted. Relief at the prospect of human contact after the unsettling experience in the cave. I waved, and after a moment's pause, she waved back and altered her course slightly to approach my campsite. As she drew closer, I could see she was probably in her late 30s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She carried a pack similar to mine, though perhaps a bit more worn, suggesting long use. "Didn't expect to see anyone else out this far," she called as she came within speaking distance. "Mind if I join your camp? Getting dark soon." "Please," I gestured to the flat area where I was setting up. "I'm Marcus." "Elena," she replied, shrugging off her pack with the practiced ease of someone who had done so thousands of times. "You heading to Alum Creek?" I nodded. "Eventually. Taking it slow, planning to be out about 2 weeks total." She raised her eyebrows. "That's a good stretch. Most folks I run into are just doing overnight trips." She began efficiently setting up her own compact tent about 20 feet from mine. "Where'd you camp last night?" "Ferris Caves," I said, busying myself with gathering wood for a fire. Elena's hands paused momentarily in the middle of securing a tent stake. "How'd you sleep?" she asked, her tone deliberately casual. Something in her voice made me look up. "Not great," I admitted. "Thought I heard someone outside my tent around 3 a.m., but there wasn't anyone there." She nodded slowly, hammering the stake into the ground with perhaps more force than necessary. "Yeah, people say things about those caves. Local legends and such." "What kind of legends?" I asked, suddenly recalling the journal in my pack. Elena finished securing her tent before answering. "Just old stories. Probably nothing." She straightened up and stretched. "Mind if I help with that fire? Gets cold quick once the sun drops behind those bluffs." We worked together gathering wood and building a fire pit. By the time darkness fell, we had a respectable blaze going and had settled into the easy camaraderie of fellow hikers. Over freeze-dried meals, we exchanged the usual trail biographies: where we were from, trails we'd hiked before, gear preferences. Elena was from Salina, about 30 miles north of the park. She'd been hiking these trails for over a decade and worked as an environmental scientist, currently studying the impact of climate change on prairie ecosystems. "What brings you out here for such a long solo trip?" she eventually asked. "Most people don't choose to spend 2 weeks alone in the backcountry without a reason." I hesitated, poking at the fire with a stick. I hadn't talked about Sarah with anyone besides Dr. Levine in weeks. But something about the anonymity of the trail, the knowledge that I'd likely never see Elena again after we parted ways, made it easier. "My wife died 3 months ago," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "Cancer. It was quick, 4 months from diagnosis to the end." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. "I'm sorry," she finally said, with a simplicity that was more comforting than any of the elaborate condolences I'd received. "Thanks, I just needed space to figure out what comes next." She nodded. The landscape has a way of putting things in perspective. We lapsed into comfortable silence as the fire burned lower. Above us, the stars emerged in their thousands, the Milky Way a brilliant slash across the black sky. "About the caves," Elena said suddenly, her voice low. "The local stories say they weren't actually built by settlers." I looked up, curious. "The historical markers say they were dug by someone named Ferris in the 1880s. "That's the official version," she agreed. "But there are older stories. The Kanza tribe that lived in this region believed those caves have existed for centuries. They called them the doorways and avoided them completely." "Doorways to what?" I asked, feeling a slight chill despite the fire's warmth. Elena shrugged. "Different versions of the story say different things. Some say to the spirit world, others say to somewhere else entirely, a place where things that aren't quite human live." I thought of the journal in my pack but decided not to mention it. "And you believe these stories?" "I believe that people have been disappearing in these hills since before European settlement," she said matter-of-factly, "and I believe that every culture develops legends to explain the dangerous parts of their world." She tossed another stick onto the fire. "Did you go into the lower chamber? The one with the rope?" My skin prickled. "How did you know about that?" "Like I said, I've been hiking these trails for years. Found it my second time camping at the caves." She studied my face. "You did go down there, didn't you? What did you find?" I described the circle of skulls and mentioned the journal, downplaying how unsettled it had made me feel. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When I finished, she was quiet for so long that I thought she might not respond at all. "You should put it back," she finally said. "The journal. Why?" "Some things aren't meant to be taken," she said simply, "especially from places like that." I laughed, trying to dispel the tension that had settled over our camp. "You sound superstitious." "Not superstitious," she corrected. "Respectful. Of history, of culture, of places with significance we might not fully understand." She stood up, brushing dirt from her pants. "Anyway, it's just advice. Take it or leave it." She bid me good night and retreated to her tent, leaving me alone with the dying fire and troubling thoughts. I pulled the journal from my pack and examined it again by flashlight. In the darkness, away from the cave, it seemed like nothing more than an old book, probably the ramblings of some settler driven to madness by isolation or illness. Still, Elena's warning lingered. With a sigh, I returned the journal to my pack, deciding I'd think about what to do with it in the morning. Sleep came easier that night, perhaps due to the comforting presence of another person nearby. I dreamed of Sarah, not as she was in her final days, thin and yellow with jaundice, but as she had been on our first backpacking trip together in Colorado, laughing, strong, alive. In the dream, we were hiking along a ridgeline much like the one I'd traversed that day. But as the trail continued, it began to change, becoming darker, narrower, more confined. The sky darkened too, stars appearing, but wrong somehow, arranged in patterns I'd never seen before. Sarah walked ahead of me, her pace quickening until she was almost running. I called after her, but she didn't turn around. "They're behind us," she said, her voice strange and flat. "They're always behind until suddenly they're in front." The trail narrowed further, becoming a tunnel through solid rock. Sarah's form grew dimmer ahead of me, and I realized with mounting panic that I was losing her again. "Wait," I called, my voice echoing oddly in the confined space. "Sarah, wait for me." She stopped and turned, her face now hidden in shadow. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from all around me, rather than from her motionless figure. "You shouldn't have taken the book, Marcus. Now they know your name." I woke with a start, heart racing. My tent was bathed in the silver-blue light of the full moon, now high overhead. My watch read 3:17 a.m., exactly the same time I'd awakened the previous night. Outside, I could hear Elena moving around. The sound of a zipper, her tent flap opening, then footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from our campsite. Still groggy and disoriented from the dream, I unzipped my tent and peered out. By the bright moonlight, I could clearly see Elena walking toward the edge of the bluff, her movements strangely stiff. "Elena?" I called softly. She didn't respond or turn around. There was something off about her gait, too regular like a wind-up toy. She continued toward the precipice, now only about 20 feet from the sheer drop. Fully awake now and alarmed, I scrambled out of my tent. "Elena, stop!" She kept walking, now just feet from the edge. I sprinted toward her, grabbing her arm just as her foot was about to step into empty air. She turned to face me, and I recoiled involuntarily. Her eyes were open but completely blank, pupils dilated so widely that her irises were barely visible rings of color. Her face was slack, expressionless. "Elena," I said, maintaining my grip on her arm while keeping my distance. "Wake up, you're sleepwalking." For a long moment, she stared through me as if I wasn't there. Then, like a television coming to life, awareness flooded back into her eyes. She looked around in confusion, then down at the precipitous drop inches from her feet. "Jesus," she whispered, taking a hasty step back. "What happened?" "You were walking in your sleep," I explained, releasing her arm now that she seemed fully conscious, heading straight for the edge. Elena shook her head, her face pale in the moonlight. "I don't sleepwalk, never have." "Well, you just did," I said. "Come on, let's get back to camp." As we walked back to our tents, I noticed Elena repeatedly glancing over her shoulder at the darkness beyond our camp. "Did you hear anything?" she asked. "Before you saw me walking?" I shook my head. "Just you moving around." "Why?" "I thought I heard someone calling my name," she said quietly. "A woman's voice. It sounded like my sister." She wrapped her arms around herself. "My sister, who died 10 years ago." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran through me. "Maybe it was just part of your dream." "Maybe," she agreed, but she didn't sound convinced. Back at our camp, neither of us felt much like returning to sleep. We rebuilt the fire instead, huddling close to its warmth as we waited for dawn. "It's the caves," Elena said suddenly, breaking the long silence. "Ever since you mentioned going into that lower chamber, I felt off, like something followed you back. I thought of the journal in my pack. You really think I should return it?" She nodded emphatically. "And we should do it first thing in the morning. Change our route if we need to." Despite my natural skepticism, I found myself agreeing. The events of the past 2 nights had been too strange to dismiss entirely, and if returning the journal would ease Elena's mind, and possibly my own, it seemed a small detour. We broke camp at first light. the pale dawn revealing a landscape shrouded in mist that clung to the contours of the hills like spectral fingers. The weather had shifted overnight, the clear skies replaced by a thick, low cloud cover that muted the sun to a diffuse glow. "Looks like rain later," Elena commented, studying the sky as we shouldered our packs. "We should try to reach the caves and get back to the main trail before it hits." The return journey to Ferris Caves took most of the morning. We hiked in silence for the most part, both lost in our own thoughts. The cheerful camaraderie of the previous evening had been replaced by a tense vigilance, both of us scanning the trail ahead and frequently glancing behind as if expecting pursuit. As we neared the caves, I noticed Elena's pace slowing. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just don't like the feel of this place," she admitted. "Never have." The caves looked different in the gray daylight, somehow more imposing, the dark entrances like sockets in a stone skull. The wind had picked up, causing a low, moaning sound as it swept across the openings. "Let's make this quick," Elena said, her voice tight. I led the way to the third cave, the one with the rope leading to the lower chamber. The air inside felt even colder than I remembered, and the descent into the lower section seemed longer, the darkness more complete. When we reached the bottom, we both stood motionless for a long moment. The circle of animal skulls remained in the center of the chamber, but now they had been rearranged, all facing outward instead of inward, as if standing guard. "I didn't do that," I whispered. "I know," Elena replied, her voice equally low. "Put the book back exactly where you found it and let's get out of here." With trembling hands, I placed the journal in the center of the circle, exactly where I had found it. As soon as it touched the ground, a sudden draft extinguished Elena's flashlight, leaving only mine illuminating the chamber. "Time to go," she said, already turning toward the rope. As we climbed back up, I couldn't shake the impression that something was moving in the darkness just beyond the reach of my light. A subtle shifting of shadows, the whisper of movement over stone. Back on the surface, we emerged from the cave to find that the weather had deteriorated further. Dark storm clouds now obscured the sky completely, and the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to fall. "We need to find shelter," Elena said, surveying the darkening landscape. "That storm looks bad." "What about the caves?" I suggested, though the thought of spending more time near them was deeply unappealing. Elena shook her head firmly. "Not an option. There's an old ranger shelter about 2 miles from here, near the junction with Buffalo Track Trail. We can wait out the storm there." The rain intensified as we hurried along the trail, quickly soaking through our rain gear. Thunder rumbled in the distance, followed by flashes of lightning that illuminated the rugged terrain in stark relief. The trail became increasingly slippery, mud sucking at our boots. Twice, Elena nearly lost her footing on steep sections. The third time, she wasn't so lucky. Her feet went out from under her on a particularly treacherous slope, and she slid several feet down the muddy incline before I could catch her arm. "You okay?" I shouted over the now pounding rain. She grimaced, testing her weight on her right foot. "Twisted my ankle. Not broken, but it's going to slow us down." I offered my shoulder for support, and we continued at a significantly reduced pace. The ranger shelter Elena had mentioned now seemed impossibly distant through the curtain of rain. "There," Elena pointed suddenly, indicating a dark opening in the hillside ahead. "That might be dry at least." It wasn't one of the main caves, but a smaller natural hollow in the sandstone bluff, barely more than an overhang, but enough to provide some shelter from the deluge. We huddled inside, catching our breath as water streamed from our soaked clothing. "Some wilderness therapy, huh?" I said, attempting humor despite our miserable situation. Elena managed a weak smile, but her attention seemed focused on something deeper in the hollow. "Marcus," she said slowly, "do you see that?" I followed her gaze. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed marks on the rear wall of the hollow, more of the primitive drawings I'd seen in the caves, but these were different. These looked fresher, the scratches in the sandstone not yet dulled by time. Moving closer, flashlight in hand, I felt my blood turn to ice. There, among crude stick figures and unidentifiable symbols, was a name carved into the stone. Marcus Whelan. "That's not possible," I whispered. "There's no way." Beside my name was another, Elena Cortez. I turned to look at her, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "Is that your last name, Cortez?" She nodded slowly, her face ashen. "We need to leave. Now." "But the storm is safer than staying here," she finished firmly, already moving toward the entrance despite her injured ankle. Outside, the storm had intensified to near-biblical proportions. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and the wind howled through the canyons with an almost human quality. Lightning struck a nearby ridge, momentarily turning the world white-hot. "This way," Elena shouted, pointing down what appeared to be a game trail rather than the main path. "It's steeper but more direct. Should get us to the ranger shelter faster." I followed her lead, my mind still reeling from what we'd seen in the hollow. Our names, carved into stone in a remote location neither of us had visited before. It defied rational explanation. The game trail was indeed steep, requiring us to half-slide down muddy slopes in several places. Elena moved with remarkable speed despite her injury, driven by what appeared to be genuine fear. "Do you know what's happening?" I called to her back as we descended a particularly treacherous section. She glanced over her shoulder, her face grim. "Not exactly, but the old stories, they say the caves mark those who enter, that they follow you." "Follow? What does that mean?" Before she could answer, a deafening crack of thunder directly overhead startled us both. Elena lost her footing on the slick terrain, tumbling down the steep incline with a cry of pain and surprise. "Elena!" I scrambled after her, sliding more than running down the muddy slope. She had come to rest against a fallen log about 30 feet below, curled into a protective ball. As I reached her, she was already trying to sit up, wincing visibly. "I'm okay," she gasped, though the way she cradled her right arm suggested otherwise. "Just banged up." "Let me see," I insisted, gently examining her arm. It wasn't broken as far as I could tell, but she had an ugly gash running from elbow to wrist that was bleeding freely. "We need to bandage that." I shrugged off my pack to get at my first aid kit, but as I did, I noticed Elena's expression change from pain to horror. She was looking at something behind me, her eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, following her gaze. Through the curtain of rain, a figure stood watching us from the top of the slope. A tall, unnaturally thin silhouette, motionless despite the howling wind and driving rain. "Don't move," Elena whispered. "Don't acknowledge it." But it was too late. The figure's head tilted slightly, an eerily bird-like movement, and then it began descending the slope toward us. Its movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, joints bending in impossible ways, feet never seeming to quite touch the ground. "Run!" Elena hissed, struggling to her feet. "Now!" We abandoned my pack, fleeing downhill through the storm. Elena moved with surprising speed for someone with injuries, though I could tell each step caused her pain. Behind us, I resisted the urge to look back, terrified of what I might see. The path leveled out as we entered a densely wooded area. Visibility was poor through the trees and rain, but I caught glimpses of what appeared to be a small structure ahead, perhaps the ranger shelter Elena had mentioned. "There," I pointed, relief flooding through me. We burst into the clearing where the shelter stood, a simple, three-sided wooden structure with a metal roof, designed to provide emergency coverage for hikers caught in storms. As basic as it was, it looked like salvation. Elena collapsed onto the wooden floor just inside the entrance, breathing heavily. Blood from her arm wound had soaked through her sleeve, mixing with rain to create pale red rivulets down her hand. I quickly gathered what dry materials I could find, old leaves and twigs that had blown into the corners of the shelter, and attempted to start a fire using the emergency matches from the small kit in my pocket. After several frustrating attempts, a small flame caught and began to grow. "We need to clean that cut," I said, turning back to Elena. She nodded absently, her attention focused on the tree line we had emerged from. "Did you see it?" she asked quietly. "When we were running?" I shook my head. I didn't look back. "It wasn't alone," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain on the metal roof. "There were others. Different shapes, but wrong. All wrong." I busied myself with tending her wound, using the small first aid supplies from my pocket kit. The cut was deep but clean, and I managed to bandage it reasonably well with what I had. "Thanks," she said, examining my handiwork. "Sorry about your pack." "We'll go back for it when the storm passes," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely convinced I wanted to return to that slope. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage around our fragile shelter. The small fire provided minimal warmth but cast unsettling shadows across the wooden walls. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate the clearing outside, and each time, I found myself tensing, expecting to see figures standing at the tree line. "How did you know about this place?" I asked eventually, partly to distract myself from those thoughts, partly because I'd begun to realize there were aspects of Elena's knowledge that seemed oddly specific. She hesitated before answering. "I told you I've been hiking these trails for years." "Yes, but you knew exactly where this shelter was, even though it's not marked on any of the maps I studied." I watched her face carefully. "And you knew about the lower chamber in the cave, about the local legends. You seemed to know what was happening when we found our names." Elena sighed, rubbing her wounded arm absently. "I used to work for the Park Service," she admitted, "as a ranger, not just an environmental scientist. There are things about this area that aren't in the official guides." "What kinds of things?" "Disappearances," she said quietly. "More than you'd expect for a relatively small state park. Hikers who vanish without a trace. Strange sightings reported by visitors. Unusual animal behavior." "And the caves?" I prompted, "are the common denominator in many of those cases." She met my eyes directly. "And now we're linked to them too." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the shelter, sending a spray of rain across our small fire, which sputtered but didn't die. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. "What about the names in the hollow?" I asked. "How is that possible?" "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "But there are places where time doesn't quite work the way we expect. Places where what will happen has, in some sense, already happened." She shook her head. "I know how that sounds." "Like complete nonsense," I agreed, but without much conviction. After what we'd seen, I wasn't in a position to dismiss anything outright. "The journal you found, Elias Thorne's journal, I've seen it before," Elena continued, "or another one like it. There have been others over the years who documented their experiences. Most of them disappeared eventually. And you didn't think to mention this yesterday when I told you I'd taken it." "Would you have believed me?" she countered. "Or would you have written me off as some superstitious local?" She had a point. Before the events of the past 24 hours, I'd have certainly dismissed such claims. Even now, part of me was looking for rational explanations, elaborate pranks, shared hallucinations, extreme coincidences. "So, what happens now?" I asked. "We return the journal. Is that enough to, I don't know, break the connection?" Elena's expression was not encouraging. "I hope so, but I think we need to get as far from this area as possible, as quickly as possible." "How? My pack is gone, your ankle is injured, your arm is cut, and there's a biblical deluge happening outside. We wait out the storm," she decided, "then head directly for the main trail. If we push hard, we can reach the visitor center by nightfall tomorrow." The prospect of another night in the backcountry after what we'd experienced was deeply unsettling, but I saw no alternative. We'd have to make do with what little we had until morning. As the afternoon wore on, our small fire began to dwindle. With no dry wood available, it was only a matter of time before we lost it completely. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and without my pack containing our sleeping bags and emergency supplies, the night ahead looked increasingly grim. "We need to conserve body heat," Elena said, stating the obvious as the last flames flickered out, "and take turns keeping watch." Outside, the storm had moderated somewhat from its initial fury but continued steadily. The light was fading rapidly, the overcast sky accelerating the onset of darkness. We huddled together in the driest corner of the shelter, backs against the wooden wall. Despite our layers of wet clothing, Elena's body felt surprisingly warm against mine. "You should try to sleep first," she suggested. "I'll wake you in a few hours to switch." Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed me. The day's physical exertion and emotional stress had drained me completely. Despite the discomfort and lingering fear, I found myself drifting off almost immediately, my head coming to rest on Elena's shoulder. I dreamed again of Sarah. This time, we were back in our apartment in Kansas City, on the night I'd told her about the abnormal lab results, before we knew for certain what they meant. In the dream, as in reality, she'd been remarkably calm, methodically researching possible diagnoses on her laptop while I paced anxiously. "Knowledge is power, Marcus," she'd said, looking up from the screen. "The more we understand, the better we can fight this." But in the dream, when she turned to face me, her eyes were wrong, completely black, like polished stones. And when she smiled, her teeth seemed too numerous, too sharp. "The more we understand," not Sarah repeated, her voice distorting, "the easier we are to find." I jerked awake with a gasp, momentarily disoriented. The shelter was now completely dark, the only light coming from occasional flashes of lightning that had grown more distant. The rain had tapered to a steady drizzle. Elena was no longer beside me. "Elena," I called softly, then louder when there was no response. "Elena!" Nothing but the patter of rain and the low moan of wind through the trees. I fumbled for my flashlight, thankful I'd kept it in my pocket rather than my now-lost pack. The beam cut through the darkness, confirming what I already knew. The shelter was empty except for me. Fighting rising panic, I moved to the open side of the structure and shined my light into the clearing. No sign of Elena. The wet ground would have shown footprints, but the continuing rain had obscured any tracks she might have left. Had she gone looking for more firewood? Unlikely in these conditions. To answer the call of nature? Possibly, but she'd have said something, and it had been at least 20 minutes since I'd awakened. "Elena!" I shouted into the darkness, my voice sounding small and ineffectual against the vast night. Only the whispering of rain through leaves answered me. I had no choice but to search for her. Stepping out into the drizzle, I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, looking for any sign of movement or color against the monochrome night. Nothing. For 10 minutes, I circled the clearing, calling Elena's name at regular intervals. With each passing moment, my anxiety grew. Whatever she'd sensed following us earlier, whatever we'd seen on the slope, might have returned while I slept. I was about to expand my search into the surrounding woods when a sound froze me in place. That same high, thin laughter I'd heard at Ferris Caves, now seeming to come from the trees directly ahead of me. "Elena," I called again, my voice cracking slightly. "Is that you?" The laughter came again, definitely not Elena's voice. It was followed by what sounded like a child's sing-song. Marcus. Marcus Waylan. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat to the shelter, to wait for daylight. But if Elena was out there, possibly hurt or in danger? Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the tree line, flashlight beam probing the darkness between trunks. The woods were eerily silent except for the drip of rainwater from leaves and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. I had gone perhaps 50 yards when I found the first sign of Elena. A scrap of fabric caught on a low branch, the same distinctive blue as her rain jacket. It was stretched taut, as if torn off while she was being pulled or dragged deeper into the forest. "Elena!" I shouted, all pretense of caution abandoned. "Can you hear me?" Something moved in the darkness ahead, a flash of blue between trees, there and gone before I could focus on it. I pursued, stumbling over roots and rocks in my haste. The terrain began to slope upward, becoming rockier and more difficult to navigate. My lungs burned with exertion, and my light bounced wildly as I ran, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The trees thinned as I climbed higher, giving way to more exposed rock. I realized with a jolt that I was ascending the same bluff where we'd found the hollow with our names carved into the stone. Near the top, I spotted a clear trail of disturbed earth and broken vegetation, as if something heavy had been dragged up the slope. Following it, I emerged onto a small plateau and stopped dead in my tracks. Elena stood at the edge of the plateau, facing away from me, looking out over the darkened landscape. She was completely motionless, her posture unnaturally rigid, arms hanging stiffly at her sides. "Elena?" I approached cautiously, circling to see her face. What I saw caused me to stumble backward in shock. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils dilated as they had been during her sleepwalking episode, but the entire visible eye covered by a glossy, obsidian-like surface. Her face was expressionless, mouth slightly open but slack. "Elena." I tried again, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Can you hear me?" Slowly, her head rotated toward me with that same bird-like tilt I'd seen in the figure on the slope. When she spoke, the voice that emerged was not entirely hers, layered somehow, as if multiple people were speaking in imperfect unison. "She hears you." Not quite, Elena said. "She is here with us." I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to flee. "Who are you?" A smile spread across Elena's face, too wide, stretching the corners of her mouth in a way that must have been painful. "We are the forgotten, the left behind, the ones who walked through when the doors were open." "The caves," I whispered, understanding dawning. "The doorways." Not, Elena nodded, the movement jerky and uncoordinated. "So many names for our home. The thin places, the in-between, but we tire of it. We wish to walk in your world again." "What have you done to Elena?" "She is accommodating us," the thing using Elena's body replied. "As you will. You opened the way when you took what was ours. The binding. The journal," I realized. "But we put it back. We returned it." "Too late," it said simply. The connection was made. Names were written. Bargains must be honored. Behind Not Elena, I became aware of movement in the darkness. Shapes forming and dissolving, some humanoid, others decidedly not. They seemed composed of deeper darkness, visible mainly by how they occluded the faint ambient light of the cloudy night sky. "What bargains?" I asked, desperately stalling while trying to think of some way out of this nightmare. "I made no bargain with you." "Elias Thorne did," the thing said. "A life for a life. He took our book, learned our secrets. In exchange, we would be permitted to walk through, but he tried to break the bargain, sealed the deeper chambers, scattered our anchors." The unnatural smile widened further. "But you found our book, opened the way again." One of the shadowy figures detached from the group and moved to stand beside Elena. As it came closer, I could make out more detail, a vaguely human shape but too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its face, if it could be called that, was smooth and featureless except for two deep recesses where eyes should be. "Your grief called to us," the thing using Elena's voice continued. "So much pain, so much emptiness. We can fill it. We can give her back to you." My blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" Not Elena extended her hand, palm up. In it lay a small, smooth stone, black as night. "A vessel, for one who has passed beyond. Your Sarah." The sound of her name in that twisted voice triggered something primal in me. Rage cutting through fear. "Don't you say her name," I snarled. "But she is here," the thing insisted. "With us. Between worlds. Neither fully gone nor fully at rest. We can bring her back. Put her in this one." It gestured at Elena's body with its free hand. "Or fashion another. Would you like that, Marcus Whelan? To have your Sarah back? For one terrible moment." I was tempted. The grief that had driven me into this wilderness roared back with full force. The desperate, irrational longing to see Sarah again, to hear her voice, to touch her skin. What wouldn't I give for that? But the thing before me wasn't offering Sarah. It was offering a perversion, a mockery, and it was already wearing Elena like a suit. "No," I said firmly, my voice stronger than I expected. "That wouldn't be Sarah, and whatever you are, you don't belong here." The smile vanished from not Elena's face, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "You do not reject us," it hissed, the multiple voices becoming discordant, grating. "The bargain must be honored. A way must remain open." The shadowy figures began to advance, moving with that same wrong fluidity I'd glimpsed earlier. The temperature seemed to plummet, my breath clouding in front of my face despite it being October in Kansas. I backed away, searching desperately for some weapon, some defense. My hands closed around a fist-sized rock, not much but better than nothing. "Let Elena go," I demanded, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Your quarrel is with me. I took the book." "The vessel is already prepared," not Elena said dismissively. "But you will house one of us too, the one who has waited longest. The first to be trapped when Thorn sealed the way." The dark figures had now formed a loose circle around me, their empty eye sockets seeming to drink in what little light remained. The tallest among them, the one that had stood beside Elena, stepped forward, reaching toward me with impossibly long fingers. In that moment of pure terror, an unexpected sound cut through the night, a human voice calling from somewhere below the plateau. A deep, authoritative voice that somehow remained steady even when shouting. "Marcus Whelan, Elena Cortez, Ranger Service." The shadowy figures hesitated, their attention diverted toward the sound. Not. Elena's face contorted with what looked like frustration or anger. "Too late," it hissed. "They are too late." But the voice came again, closer now. "We see your lights. Stay where you are." A powerful beam suddenly illuminated the edge of the plateau, a spotlight far stronger than my small flashlight. In its glare, I caught a clearer glimpse of the figures surrounding me, and immediately wished I hadn't. What I had taken for featureless faces were anything but. They were simply too alien, too wrong for my mind to process properly. Like optical illusions of impossible geometry given nightmarish form. The creatures retreated from the light, their movements becoming more frantic, less coordinated. Elena's body convulsed suddenly, her back arching at an unnatural angle as she collapsed to the ground. I rushed to her side, heedless of the danger. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but present. The black stone that had been in her palm was nowhere to be seen. Behind me, I heard the sounds of people climbing the slope. Multiple voices now, the beams of several powerful lights sweeping the plateau. When I looked up again, the shadowy figures had vanished completely. "Over here!" I shouted, waving my flashlight. "She needs help." 3 figures crested the rise, park rangers in full gear, led by the leathery man I recognized as Dawson, who had issued my backcountry permit. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" he demanded, hurrying to where Elena lay. "We've had search parties out since the storm hit. Your emergency beacon activated." I stared at him in confusion. "I don't have an emergency beacon." "It's in the standard backcountry permits," he said distractedly, checking Elena's vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Embedded GPS. Automatically triggers if you don't register at checkpoints within specified intervals." He gestured to the other rangers. Radio for medevac. Tell them we have an injured hiker, possibly hypothermic, additional injuries unknown." As the other rangers moved to comply, Dawson turned his attention back to me. "What happened to her? And where's your gear?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what we'd experienced? That something from another reality or dimension had possessed Elena, that we'd been pursued by creatures that shouldn't exist. "We got separated in the storm," I said finally. "I lost my pack on a slope during a fall. Elena hurt her arm and ankle. We found shelter, but she wandered off while I was sleeping. I think she might have been delirious from her injuries." Dawson studied my face, his expression suggesting he didn't entirely believe me but wasn't going to press the issue. "You're lucky we found you. Another night out here in these conditions." I nodded, relief washing over me now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed. But as the rangers prepared Elena for evacuation, carefully placing her on a portable stretcher, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd escaped too easily, that whatever had been using her body hadn't simply given up and departed. The medevac helicopter arrived within 30 minutes, touching down in a relatively flat area about a quarter-mile from the plateau. As we carried Elena's stretcher toward it, her eyes fluttered open. For one terrifying moment, I expected to see that glossy black surface again. But they were normal. Brown irises, white sclera, pupils contracting in the harsh lights of the approaching helicopter. "Marcus," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the noise of the rotors. "What happened?" "It's okay," I reassured her, unsure if I was lying. "You're safe now. We both are." Her hand caught mine with surprising strength. "Don't leave me," she whispered urgently. "Promise you won't leave me alone." "I won't," I promised, climbing into the helicopter behind her stretcher despite a ranger's protest. "I'm right here." The flight to Salina Regional Health Center took less than 20 minutes. Upon arrival, Elena was immediately taken for evaluation, while I was led to a different examination room to be checked for hypothermia and other injuries. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, found nothing seriously wrong with me beyond mild hypothermia, dehydration, and various cuts and bruises. As she bandaged a particularly nasty gash on my forearm that I hadn't even noticed in the chaos, she casually mentioned that there had been several hikers brought in from Canopolis over the past month. "Something about that park this season," she remarked, securing the bandage. "Never seen so many accidents in such a short time, and the psychiatric symptoms some of them display." She seemed to catch herself, perhaps remembering patient confidentiality. "Well, you're lucky. You'll be fine with rest and fluids." "What about my friend?" I asked. "Elena Cortez? She came in with me." The doctor's expression changed subtly. "I'm not treating Ms. Cortez directly, but I understand she's stable. You should be able to see her once she's settled in a room." True to her word, I was allowed to visit Elena about an hour later. She had been given a private room in what I later learned was the hospital's recently expanded psychiatric wing. When I entered, she was awake, propped up against pillows, her injured arm properly bandaged, an IV running into her other arm. "Hey," I said softly, taking the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" She glanced at me, then quickly away. "Physically? Just banged up. Otherwise..." She trailed off, staring at the wall. "Do you remember what happened?" I asked carefully. Elena's free hand clutched at the blanket, knuckles whitening. "Some of it. Fragments. It was like watching a movie of myself from very far away. I could see what was happening but couldn't stop it." A tear slid down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Marcus." "It wasn't your fault," I assured her, covering her hand with mine. "Whatever those things were, they were using you, controlling you somehow." She turned to face me fully now, her expression frightened but determined. "They're still here," she whispered. Not in control, but I can feel them, waiting, watching through my eyes sometimes." A chill ran through me. Have you told the doctors? She laughed bitterly. Oh yes. That's why I'm in the psych ward and not general medicine. They think I'm having some kind of breakdown. Post-traumatic psychosis, they're calling it. I can tell them what I saw, I offered. Back you up. And join me under observation? No. She squeezed my hand. Besides, I'm not sure it would help. These things, they've existed alongside us for so long without being detected. They know how to hide. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Outside the window, dawn was breaking, the sky clearing after the storm to reveal a crystalline October morning. What do we do now? I finally asked. Elena's expression was grim. I don't know if there's anything we can do. The connection has been made. They found a way through, and I don't think they're going to just let go. There has to be something, I insisted. The journal mentioned a bargain being broken, and you said earlier that Thorn sealed the deeper chambers. Maybe there's a way to close whatever door we accidentally opened. She considered this. Maybe. But we'd need to understand more about what happened in 1891. What Thorn did, exactly. Research, I nodded. Historical records, local archives. There must be something. And we'd need to go back, she said quietly, to the caves, to find whatever Thorn used to seal the way. The thought of returning to Ferris Caves made my stomach clench with fear, but I knew she was right. If there was any hope of freeing Elena, and potentially ourselves, from whatever connection had been established, the answer likely lay where this had all begun. A nurse entered the room, interrupting our conversation. Time for meds, Ms. Cortez, and you've got another visitor. I looked up, surprised, as Ranger Dawson entered behind the nurse. He looked even more weathered in the harsh hospital lighting, his uniform rumpled from what had clearly been a long night. Glad to see you both recovering, he said without preamble. Thought I should check in before heading back to the park. The nurse administered Elena's medication and left, closing the door behind her. As soon as she was gone, Dawson's casual demeanor shifted subtly. Now, he said, pulling up another chair, want to tell me what really happened out there? Elena and I exchanged glances. I'm not sure what you mean, I hedged. Dawson sighed heavily. Look, I've been a ranger at Canopolis for 37 years. I've seen things in those hills that don't make a lick of sense by any rational standard, and what happened to you two fits a pattern I've been tracking for decades. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully unwrapping it, he revealed a smooth black stone identical to the one not Elena had held on the plateau. Found this near where we picked you up, he said, keeping the stone on the cloth rather than touching it directly. And I'm guessing you recognize it. Elena had gone pale, shrinking back against her pillows. You should destroy that, she whispered. Tried, Dawson said simply. Doesn't break, doesn't burn, doesn't dissolve in any chemical I can legally get my hands on. He rewrapped the stone carefully. But it does sing sometimes, late at night, and things move around my house when I'm not looking. I stared at him, a new understanding dawning. You know about the caves, about what's in them. He nodded slowly. Not everything, maybe not even most of it, but enough to know that what lives in the in-between places should stay there. He fixed his gaze on Elena. And I know when someone's brought something back with them. Can you help us? She asked, a note of desperate hope in her voice. Maybe, Dawson admitted. I've been collecting information for decades. Journals, local accounts, historical records. There are others who've encountered these things and survived. Some found ways to disconnect. How? I pressed. It varies, he said, but it usually involves a ritual of some kind, something symbolic that severs the connection. He stood up, replacing the wrapped stone in his pocket. I need to get back to the park, but I'll bring my research next time I visit. Might be something in there that can help. As he turned to leave, I called after him. Wait, how did you know? About us, I mean, that we'd encountered them. Dawson paused at the door, his expression unreadable. "Because I've carried one with me for 32 years, he said quietly, "ever since I found my own black stone in Horsethief Canyon. You learn to recognize the signs in others." He tapped his temple. The look in the eyes, that momentary slippage when something else is looking out. With that disturbing revelation, he left, promising to return in a few days with his research. After Dawson's departure, Elena was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the bright autumn day that seemed so at odds with our dark conversation. "I always felt there was something wrong with those caves," she finally said. "Even before I knew the stories, before I found the chamber with the skulls. Some places just feel thin, like the normal rules don't quite apply." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "What do you think they are? Really?" She considered the question carefully. "I don't think they're demons or spirits, at least not in the religious sense. They're just different from somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to our reality but operating under different physical laws. And they want to be here," I added. "In our world. Wouldn't you, if you lived in a place of shadows and half-existence?" she asked. "If you could see a world of substance and sensation just beyond your reach?" I shuddered, remembering the offer not Elena had made, to bring Sarah back, to put her in a vessel. Had that been possible? Or just another manipulation? "We'll find a way to help you," I promised, taking her hand again, "to break this connection." Elena smiled wearily, the medication beginning to take effect. "And what about you, Marcus? Do you feel it too? That sense of being observed from within?" I hesitated, not wanting to worry her further, but there had been moments since our rescue, brief, disorienting flashes when the world seemed to shift slightly, as if seen through different eyes. A subtle wrongness at the edges of my perception. "Maybe," I admitted, "but not as strongly as you described. I think you're protecting me somehow, taking the brunt of it." Her eyes were growing heavy, the sedatives pulling her towards sleep. "No one deserves to carry this alone," she murmured. "We opened the door together. We'll close it together." As she drifted off, I remained by her side, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Outside, the morning sun continued to climb, its light warm and reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that regardless of how brightly it shone, a shadow had attached itself to us, a shadow that no natural light could dispel. 3 days later, Dawson returned as promised, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with papers, photographs, and small artifacts collected over decades. Together, the three of us pored over his research, looking for anything that might help break the connection to the entities from the caves. What we discovered was both disturbing and hopeful. According to Dawson's records, there had been at least 27 documented encounters with the Thin Ones, as he called them, over the past century. Of those, 9 people had managed to sever their connections through various means, typically involving a ritual return to the place where the initial contact was made, combined with some form of sympathetic magic. "The basic principle seems to be substitution," Dawson explained, showing us the account of a woman from 1972 who had freed herself by leaving a clay figurine of herself in the cave where she'd found her black stone. "You have to give them something to anchor to instead of yourself, a representation that's just real enough to satisfy whatever rules they operate by." "And this works?" Elena asked skeptically. "Sometimes," Dawson admitted. "For her, it did. For others." He gestured to several accounts with less favorable outcomes. "Let's just say you don't want to botch the ritual. Seems like that makes them angry." We spent hours analyzing the successful cases, looking for common elements we could incorporate into our own attempt. The most promising was the account of a man named Joseph Miller, who, in 1943, had encountered the entities in Horsethief Canyon and later broken their hold by burying a handmade doll containing his hair, blood, and fingernails in the exact spot where he'd found his black stone. "It's an old folk magic concept," Dawson explained. "Poppets, sympathetic connection, giving them a link to you that isn't actually you." "But where exactly do we need to do this?" I asked. "The lower chamber where I found the journal? The hollow where our names were carved? The plateau where they manifested?" Dawson shook his head. "Based on these accounts, it would be where the first connection was made. For you, that's probably the lower chamber in Ferris Caves." Elena was scheduled to be released from the hospital the following day. Despite the doctor's recommendation for psychiatric follow-up, she had convinced them that her episode had been a one-time occurrence brought on by physical trauma and exposure. I suspected her professional background with the Park Service had lent her story additional credibility. We agreed to meet Dawson at the Canopolis Visitor Center 2 days later. That would give us time to gather the materials needed for the ritual and for Elena to regain some strength. Though neither of us said it aloud, we both knew that returning to the caves would be dangerous in ways no standard wilderness precautions could address. The night before Elena's release, I dreamed of Sarah again. We were in our kitchen, making dinner together as we had hundreds of times. Everything felt normal, comfortable, until she turned to face me, and I saw that her eyes had that same obsidian blackness I'd seen in Elena's on the plateau. "They're using her against you," Not Sarah said matter-of-factly, continuing to chop vegetables as if nothing was amiss. "Your memories, your grief, your guilt. You're not real," I told the apparition. "You're not her." "Not," Sarah smiled, that same too-wide smile that had distorted Elena's face. "But I could be. That's the offer. That's always been the offer. A vessel for what you've lost." "At what cost?" I demanded. "Does it matter?" Not Sarah asked, setting down the knife and approaching me. Even her movements were wrong now, too fluid, joints bending against nature. "If you could have her back, hold her again? Tell her all the things left unsaid?" I backed away but found myself against the wall, unable to retreat further. "Not." Sarah reached out, her hand now elongated, fingers too numerous and jointed in impossible places. "The door is open, Marcus," she whispered, her voice layering and distorting. "It can never truly close again, but you can choose what comes through." I woke with a start, heart racing, my hotel room bathed in the pale blue light of pre-dawn. For a disorienting moment, I thought I saw a tall, thin figure standing in the corner, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. That morning, I picked up Elena from the hospital. She looked better physically. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she moved more easily despite the bandages on her arm and the brace on her ankle. But there was a guardedness in her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "I see them when I sleep," she confided as I drove us back to my hotel. "Not just in dreams. When I close my eyes, it's like I can see through to where they are." She shuddered. "And they can see me watching." "It'll be over soon," I promised, hoping it was true. "2 more days, and we'll perform the ritual." She nodded, but didn't seem entirely convinced. "Have you felt it more? Their presence?" I considered lying to reassure her, but honesty seemed more important now. "Yes, especially at night. Dreams that aren't quite dreams, seeing things at the corner of my vision." I kept my eyes fixed on the road, and I think they're using Sarah somehow, using my memories of her. "They use whatever connections are strongest," Elena said softly. "Whatever has the most emotional power over us." She turned to look out the window. "For me, it's my sister, the one who died. They wear her face when they speak to me in dreams." We spent that day and the next gathering what we needed for the ritual. Small wooden dolls from a craft store, which we would modify to represent ourselves. Personal items to establish the sympathetic connection. Hair, fingernail clippings, drops of blood. Black cloth to wrap the effigies. and various other components suggested by the successful cases in Dawson's research. Neither of us spoke much during these preparations. There was a sense of borrowed time, of something watching and waiting just beyond our perception. Twice I caught Elena staring blankly at nothing, her eyes momentarily unfocused, before snapping back to awareness with no memory of the lapse. On the morning we were to meet Dawson, I woke to find Elena already dressed and waiting, sitting motionless by the hotel room window. She had been released to my care with the understanding that I would ensure she attended her follow-up psychiatric appointments we both knew she would never keep if our plan worked. "You're up early," I remarked, checking the time. It was barely 5 a.m. "Couldn't sleep," she replied without turning. "They're getting stronger, Marcus. More present." I joined her at the window, looking out at the still dark parking lot below. "In what way?" "Last night I lost time," she said quietly. "I woke up standing in the bathroom, staring in the mirror. But I have no memory of getting out of bed or walking there." She finally turned to face me, her expression haunted. "And I think I was speaking to myself, in a language I don't know." The drive to Canopolis State Park was tense but uneventful. We arrived at the visitor center just as the sun was clearing the horizon, casting long shadows across the autumn landscape. The parking lot was empty except for Dawson's official ranger vehicle and one other park service truck. Dawson was waiting for us inside, grim-faced but determined. He had brought additional supplies, sage for purification, chalk for drawing protective circles, and small silver mirrors that, according to his research, the entities seemed to avoid or find distressing. "Ready?" he asked simply. We nodded, though readiness seemed an absurd concept for what we were about to attempt. "I've closed the trail to Ferris Caves for maintenance," Dawson explained as we loaded our gear into his truck. "No one should disturb us." He glanced at Elena. "How are you holding up?" "Still me, mostly," she replied with forced lightness. "For now." The drive to the trailhead passed mostly in silence. I found myself staring out the window at the familiar landscape, the rugged sandstone formations, the rolling prairie, wondering if I would ever see it again through unclouded eyes. Or at all. We began our hike to the caves under a perfect blue October sky, the temperature cool but comfortable for exertion. Under different circumstances, it would have been an idyllic day for a trail walk. Now, each step toward our destination felt weighted with dread. Elena moved slowly but steadily despite her injured ankle, refusing assistance even on the steeper sections. As we neared the caves, however, her pace slowed further, her breathing becoming more labored. "They know," she whispered, stopping completely about 100 yards from the cave entrances. "They know what we're trying to do." I felt it too, a palpable resistance, as if the air itself had thickened, making each step forward require more effort than the last. Above us, the sky remained clear, but around the cave entrances, the air seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. "Stay focused," Dawson urged, moving ahead to take the lead. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, remember why we're here." The caves looked exactly as I remembered them. 3 dark openings in the sandstone bluff, unassuming yet somehow ominous. As we approached, I noticed the temperature dropping noticeably, our breath beginning to form small clouds despite the mild day. "We should establish a perimeter," Dawson said, removing chalk and salt from his pack. "According to the accounts, it helps to create boundaries." While he began marking a circle around the clearing in front of the caves, I helped Elena unpack the dolls we had prepared, crude wooden figures customized with our personal items woven into them, wrapped in black cloth except for the faces, which we had painted to crudely resemble ourselves. "Do you think this will actually work?" Elena asked quietly as we arranged our materials. "Or are we just giving them more power by acknowledging them?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But doing nothing definitely won't work, and I'd rather fail trying than surrender without a fight." She nodded, squeezing my hand briefly before returning to her preparations. Once Dawson had completed the protective circle, we gathered our courage and approached the third cave, the one with the rope leading to the lower chamber. The air grew colder still as we entered, our flashlight beams cutting through darkness that seemed almost tangible in its density. I led the way down the rope to the lower chamber, fighting mounting anxiety with each foot of descent. The chamber appeared much as I had left it. The circle of animal skulls, now once again facing inward, the journal in the center. But the atmosphere felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the very air was reluctant to fill our lungs. Elena followed, moving cautiously on her injured ankle, with Dawson coming last. When we were all assembled in the chamber, Dawson began marking another chalk circle around its perimeter, muttering what sounded like prayers or incantations under his breath. "The skulls," Elena whispered, pointing. "Look." I followed her gaze and felt my skin crawl. The skulls were crying, black, viscous tears that leaked from their empty eye sockets pooling on the stone floor beneath them. "Ignore it," Dawson instructed firmly. "It's a manifestation meant to distract us. Focus on the ritual." Following the most successful accounts from Dawson's research, we positioned ourselves around the chamber. Elena and I would place our effigy dolls in the center of the skull circle, replacing the journal, while reciting the words that Joseph Miller had used in 1943, a mixture of Latin phrases and what appeared to be phonetic approximations of Native American terms. As I removed the journal from the center of the circle, a low moan seemed to emanate from the very stone around us, not heard with the ears so much as felt in the bones. The temperature plummeted further, frost beginning to form on the walls of the chamber. "They're responding," Dawson said, his voice tight with tension. "Keep going. Don't stop no matter what happens." I placed my effigy doll in the center, Elena doing the same with hers. As our fingers touched the ground in the center of the skull circle, a violent tremor ran through the chamber, dislodging small stones from the ceiling. "Now," Dawson urged, "start the invocation." We began reciting the words from the paper he had prepared, our voices echoing strangely in the confined space. The Latin felt awkward on my tongue, the unfamiliar native terms even more so, but we pressed on, gaining confidence as the ritual progressed. Halfway through the recitation, the moaning from the walls intensified, becoming a discordant chorus of voices, some howling in what might have been rage or pain, others whispering in languages I couldn't identify but somehow understood on a visceral level. They were threatening, pleading, promising, a cacophony of manipulations. Elena faltered in her recitation, her eyes widening as she stared at something behind me. "Anna," she whispered, using her sister's name. "It's not real," I reminded her sharply. "Keep going. Don't look." With visible effort, she dragged her attention back to the ritual, rejoining me in the recitation. But now I could sense a presence behind me as well, a familiar presence that made my heart ache with recognition even as my mind rejected its possibility. "Marcus," Sarah's voice called softly. "Please don't do this. I'm so close to coming back to you." My voice wavered, the words momentarily forgotten as every fiber of my being wanted to turn, to see her face one more time, even knowing it wasn't truly her. "The final lines," Dawson urged. "Finish it." With enormous effort, I forced the last few phrases out, Elena joining me for the final words. As we completed the recitation, I used a small silver knife to cut my palm, letting several drops of blood fall onto my effigy. Elena did the same, wincing as the blade bit into her skin. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The moaning rose to a shriek that threatened to shatter our eardrums. The walls of the chamber appeared to flex and distort, solid stone momentarily becoming fluid, impossible geometries forming and dissolving. The air itself seemed to tear open around us, not visually, but in some other sense I couldn't articulate. Like reality itself was being punctured, allowing something to leak through from elsewhere. Dark figures began to materialize around the chamber, the same tall, wrong-jointed entities I had glimpsed on the plateau. They moved with unnatural speed, circling us, reaching with two long fingers toward our effigy dolls in the center. "The mirrors!" Dawson shouted over the cacophony. "Now!" We raised the small silver mirrors he had provided, angling them to reflect the entities. Where the light struck them, they recoiled, their forms distorting further, becoming less coherent. In the center of the skull circle, our effigies had begun to change, the crude wooden surfaces taking on a glossy, wet appearance, the painted faces becoming more detailed, more lifelike. It was as if they were transforming from simple dolls into miniature versions of ourselves. "It's working," Elena gasped, holding her mirror steady despite her obvious terror. "Keep them back." One of the entities lunged past our mirror barrier, reaching for Elena with finger-like appendages that stretched and multiplied as they extended. Before it could touch her, Dawson interposed himself, reflecting the creature's own image back at it with his mirror. The entity convulsed, its form unraveling like smoke in a strong wind. But in that moment of distraction, another had circled behind Dawson. I shouted a warning, but too late. The creature's elongated limb wrapped around his throat, yanking him backward into the darkness beyond our circle. "Dawson!" I moved to help him, but Elena's hand on my arm stopped me. "Don't break the circle," she urged. "We're too close." She was right. In the center, our effigies were now almost completely transformed. Small, perfect replicas of ourselves, pulsating with a life that was both obscene and mesmerizing. The entities seemed to realize what was happening. Their movements became more frantic, less coordinated. The one that had taken Dawson dragged him further into the shadows, his struggles growing weaker. A terrible choice presented itself: complete the ritual or try to save Dawson. Before I could decide, Elena made the choice for both of us. "Finish it," she said firmly, pressing something into my hand. The black stone Dawson had found on the plateau, which he must have given to her. "Complete the substitution." Understanding what she meant, I placed the stone between our effigies. The reaction was instantaneous. The stone began to absorb the darkness from the air, drawing it like a magnet. The entities shrieked in what sounded like both rage and hunger, abandoning Dawson to rush toward the stone. "The final words!" Elena shouted over the chaos. Together we spoke the closing phrases of the ritual, words of binding, of sealing, of separation. As the last syllable left our lips, the black stone shattered with the sound of breaking glass. A shockwave of force knocked us both backward. For a moment, total darkness engulfed the chamber. When our flashlights flickered back to life, the scene had transformed. The skull circle was scattered, the effigies gone, and the air lighter somehow, clearer. Dawson lay crumpled against the far wall, unconscious but breathing. Of the entities, there was no sign except fine black dust scattered across the floor, the remains of the shattered stone. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice hoarse from shouting. Elena closed her eyes as if looking inward. "I think so," she said cautiously. "I feel empty, but in a good way. Like something that was pressing against my thoughts is gone." I recognized the feelings she described, the subtle wrongness, the sense of being observed from within. It had vanished. Where before there had been a lurking presence at the edges of my consciousness, now there was only the blessed banality of my own thoughts. We helped Dawson back to the surface, where he gradually regained consciousness. He was disoriented, but otherwise unharmed, with no memory of what had happened after being dragged into the darkness. "Did we succeed?" he asked weakly as we emerged into the sunlight. "I think so," Elena replied, smiling for what seemed like the first time in days. "Whatever connection they established, it's broken." Dawson studied both our faces carefully, then nodded in satisfaction. "The look is gone from your eyes," he confirmed. "The slippage, as I call it. You're just you now." The hike back to the trailhead was exhausting but cathartic, each step taking us further from the darkness we had confronted. By unspoken agreement, none of us looked back at the caves as we departed. Dawson drove us back to the visitor center in contemplative silence. Only when we were preparing to leave in my car did he speak again. "You should know," he said gravely, "this might not be the end. The connection is broken for now, but once you've been touched by them, you remain sensitive, more aware of the thin places." "Like you've been for 32 years?" I asked. He nodded. "It gets easier with time. The dreams become less frequent, the glimpses less disturbing." He managed a wry smile. "And there's a certain advantage to knowing what's really out there, hiding behind the walls of reality." "I'm not sure I see it that way," Elena admitted. "I'd rather forget all of this." "You won't," Dawson said simply, "but you'll learn to live with the knowledge, and perhaps that's better than blissful ignorance in the end." We parted ways with promises to stay in touch, though I suspected all three of us would eventually seek distance from the memories we now shared. On the drive back to Kansas City, Elena finally asked the question that had been hanging between us. What now? For us, I mean. It was a complicated question. We had been through something profound together, something that had created a bond unlike any other. But was that foundation enough for whatever might come next? "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I came to Canopolis to escape my grief, to find some kind of reset. Instead, I gestured vaguely, unable to encapsulate the experience in words. Nightmares? Interdimensional entities? A psychiatric case study?" she suggested with dark humor. "And you," I added softly. "I found you." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the landscape pass outside her window. "I'm going back to Selena," she finally said. "Back to my research work. But maybe we could stay in touch? See where things go when we're not fighting for our souls against ancient cave monsters?" I smiled, feeling a lightness that had nothing to do with our supernatural liberation. "I'd like that." 6 months have passed since those events in Canopolis State Park. I've returned to Kansas City, taken a new job, started rebuilding a life. Elena and I speak weekly, and I've visited her in Selena twice. There's something growing between us, something tentative but promising. The grief for Sarah hasn't disappeared, but it's changed shape, become something I can carry without being crushed by its weight. Sometimes I wonder if my encounter with the entities, their offer to bring her back, was a necessary step in accepting that some doors, once closed, cannot and should not be reopened. Dawson was right about the dreams. They continue, though less frequently now. Sometimes I see the caves, the skull circle, the tall, wrong-jointed figures moving in darkness. Sometimes I hear Sarah's voice calling from somewhere I cannot reach, but these are just dreams now, not visitations. I've become more sensitive to what Dawson called the thin places, locations where reality seems stretched slightly too thin, where the rules of nature feel negotiable. I avoid them when I can, just as I avoid thinking too deeply about what might exist in the spaces between spaces. Elena has found similar thin places in her research areas. Ancient buffalo wallows that seem to swallow sound, sections of prairie where watches run backward, isolated groves where birds refuse to land. We document them carefully but discreetly, creating our own research archive much like Dawson's. Last week, I received a package from him, photocopies of the Elias Thorne Journal, along with notes on similar encounters throughout Kansas history. His accompanying letter suggested that knowledge, properly maintained and shared, might be our best defense against the darkness that lingers at the edges of our world. I don't know if he's right, but I do know that whatever lurks in Ferris Caves, whatever pressed against the boundaries of our reality, remains there still, waiting for another unwitting explorer to take what isn't theirs, to open doors best left closed. And sometimes, on sleepless nights when the wind sounds too much like distant laughter, I find myself reaching for the phone to call Elena, needing the reassurance of someone who understands that not all ghost stories are fiction, not all monsters imaginary. because my name is Marcus Whelan, and I am 32 years old, and this happened in October 2023. And the fact that you're reading this means part of me still fears that the connection was never truly broken, that in sharing this story, I might be opening yet another door.